June 1942. The Pacific burns. The Japanese Empire stretches across the ocean, undefeated. Pearl Harbor still smolders. America is reeling, desperate, outnumbered. And now, they're coming for Midway. But in the shadows, someone is listening. A broken code, a desperate plan, and a fleet held together with rust, duct tape, and hope. This is not a story of power. It's a story of timing, of sacrifice, of men flying into fire with no chance of return. Because they had to. In just 3 minutes, the tide of World War II would turn forever. This is the Battle of Midway. Chapter 1. Shadows over Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. The morning began like any other on the island of Oahu. Warm sunlight, still waters, sailors laughing over breakfast, and a quiet sky. But that calm was an illusion, because in a matter of minutes, the sky would crack open. Fire would rain from above, and the United States Pacific Fleet, proud and powerful, would be reduced to smoldering wreckage. At exactly 7:55 a.m., the first wave of Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor. No warning, no declaration, just chaos. The sound of machine gun fire echoed across the harbor. Bombs whistled through the air. Battleships, once symbols of American might, were shattered in place. The USS Arizona took a direct hit. Her forward magazines, massive storage rooms filled with explosive shells, detonated in an instant. The blast tore through the hull, split steel like paper, and killed over 1,100 men in seconds. Many never had time to reach the deck. Others were trapped below as the ship sank in flames. The explosion was so violent, it lifted the Arizona from the water before slamming her back down, broken and burning. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma rolled over and capsized. Sailors clawed at the hull from the inside, banging on steel, screaming for help, as the ship slowly turned belly up. The rescue crews could hear them, but they couldn't get through fast enough. Smoke blanketed the harbor. Oil burned on the water's surface. Sailors leapt from decks into flaming seas. Some swam through patches of fire to survive. Others never surfaced again. In less than 2 hours, more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Over 1,000 more were wounded. 8 battleships were damaged or destroyed. Nearly 200 aircraft lay in ruins. It wasn't just an attack. It was humiliation. A sucker punch to the gut of a nation that hadn't even declared war. The Japanese had planned it down to the minute. 6 aircraft carriers. Over 300 planes. They launched from far out at sea, cloaked by distance and timing. The surprise was total. The damage, incalculable. In Washington, the news landed like a thunderclap. President Franklin Roosevelt, known for his measured tone, addressed the nation the next day. His voice, calm but firm, called it what it was, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war within hours. The United States was now fully in World War II. But the cost of that awakening had already been paid in blood. For Japan, Pearl Harbor was supposed to be the beginning of the end for American naval power in the Pacific. With the fleet crippled, their path across the ocean seemed wide open. And for a time it was. In the months that followed, Japan struck like lightning. The Philippines, Guam, Hong Kong, Malaya, Wake Island. One by one, American outposts and Allied strongholds fell. The Japanese Empire expanded like wildfire, fast, ruthless, and seemingly unstoppable. The psychological toll was immense. The American public, stunned by Pearl Harbor, now watched as news of defeat followed news of defeat. The enemy was advancing. The Pacific was shrinking. And worse, the heart of the U.S. Navy, its battleships, was gone. But there was something the Japanese hadn't destroyed. The American aircraft carriers, those floating air bases that could strike from hundreds of miles away, were not in Pearl Harbor that morning. The USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga had been out at sea. Pure luck, or fate. In their absence, those carriers would become the centerpiece of a new kind of naval war. One fought not by massive battleships lining up for direct fire, but by planes launched from over the horizon. A war of mobility, of timing, of intelligence. And in the shadows of the devastation, some were already preparing for that next chapter. One of them was Admiral Chester Nimitz. In late December, just 3 weeks after the attack, he took command of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He walked aboard the USS Grayling in Pearl Harbor, saluted the flag flying above a graveyard of ships, and began rebuilding a navy from the ashes. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. But he listened. He studied. And above all, he believed the United States could strike back. He knew it would take time, luck, and sacrifice. But Nimitz also knew something else. Japan had made a critical mistake. By striking first, and striking so hard, they had awakened a giant. And now that giant was learning, adapting, watching, and somewhere beneath the pain and smoke and fury, something else was happening. American codebreakers, men working in small, unmarked rooms, were picking apart Japan's radio messages. They couldn't see the enemy ships, but they could hear them, and that sound would soon lead to something far bigger than revenge. It would lead to Midway, but at the start, that seemed impossible. How do you fight a navy you can't see? How do you strike when you're outnumbered? When your enemies have momentum, confidence, and command of the skies? The answers were still unclear. But what was clear was that Pearl Harbor had changed everything. The Pacific was now a battlefield, and every ship, every plane, every decision would carry the weight of that morning in December. On the ocean floor, the wreckage of the USS Arizona still bled oil. Even now, long after the flames had died, the sea held her grief. Families waited for news that would never come. Mothers clutched telegrams. Wives packed away uniforms. Children asked questions that fathers would never answer. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military failure. It was a national trauma. It left a scar, but it also carved out a purpose. And that purpose was clear: never again. Admirals, pilots, sailors, engineers, they all felt it. Not in words, but in the quiet, heavy silence of what had been lost. And in that silence, plans were already forming. Plans to strike back. Yet even then, few could imagine what was coming. That within 6 months, the United States would face the same navy that had shattered Pearl Harbor, and not just survive the encounter, but win. Not with more ships, not with superior numbers, but with broken codes, brave pilots, and a moment of timing so perfect it would rewrite the war. But before that could happen, they had to understand the enemy, follow his moves, predict his intentions. And in a room in Hawaii, one man was starting to do exactly that. He didn't wear medals. He didn't command fleets. But what he was about to uncover would change the fate of the Pacific. His name was Joseph Rockefford, and he was listening. Midway was still months away, but the clock had already started, and the next move belonged to the shadows. Chapter 2: The Rise of Yamamoto. Smoke still hung over the shattered hulls of American battleships in Pearl Harbor when a new storm began to take shape. One not of steel and fire, but of strategy and shadows. The man at its center wasn't loud, or boastful, or bloodthirsty. He was quiet, precise, a chess master in a world drunk on war. His name was Isuroku Yamamoto, and he had a plan that would shape the fate of the Pacific. But before his fleet ever moved, before a single torpedo was primed, Yamamoto saw something few others did. He had studied in the United States. He knew its people, their resolve, their industry, their limitless resources, and above all, their capacity for vengeance. That's what terrified him. And that's why he believed Pearl Harbor hadn't ended a war. It had only awakened a giant. Yamamoto wasn't just an admiral. He was the admiral, the architect behind Japan's greatest victories and its most dangerous gambles. He didn't rise through the ranks by sheer ambition. He rose through insight and foresight. While others saw glory in conquest, he saw cracks forming beneath the empire's feet. Time, he believed, was not on Japan's side. By the winter of 1942, Yamamoto knew the clock was ticking. The United States, though wounded, was already recovering. Shipyards buzzed like hives. Pilots were being trained by the thousands. Factories once churning out cars now fed the war machine. Soon, America's Navy would be bigger than ever, stronger, angrier. And when that tide came crashing down, Japan's fragile gains would vanish like mist. He had to act, and fast. But a simple battle wouldn't be enough. Yamamoto wanted annihilation. Not just a strike against American ships, but a death blow to American morale. The heart of the Pacific Fleet had to be carved out, and it had to happen before the U.S. could regain its footing. It had to be decisive, spectacular, unforgettable. And so he turned to Midway. Midway Atoll, a dot in the ocean, barely visible on a map. But in Yamamoto's eyes, it was the perfect trap. Far enough west to draw the Americans out, close enough to supply his carriers. The idea was bold. Send a powerful force toward Midway, make it look like Japan was planning a full invasion, and wait for the U.S. fleet to respond. Once they took the bait, Yamamoto's ships would pounce from the shadows, surround them, sink them, and win the war in a single, elegant stroke. It was a gamble built on precision, on deception, on timing so tight. Even a few hours could unravel everything. Yamamoto knew the Americans would fight for Midway. It was too close to Hawaii, too symbolic. And most of all, it was a stepping stone. If Japan took Midway, they could threaten Pearl Harbor again. They could even strike the U.S. mainland. The Americans had to defend it. Yamamoto would make sure of that. But there was a catch. To make the plan work, Yamamoto needed secrecy. Absolute secrecy. Not just about the target, but the very movement of his fleets. The Japanese Navy would fan out across thousands of miles, with aircraft carriers leading the charge, supported by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Meanwhile, a second force would pretend to attack the Aleutian Islands, drawing attention northward. It was a sprawling, complex operation, one that required flawless coordination across the vast blue wilderness of the Pacific. If even one part slipped out of place, it could all collapse. Yamamoto trusted in Japanese code systems, in radio silence, in the discipline of his sailors. He believed the Americans were still reeling from Pearl Harbor, that their morale was shaken, that their intelligence was blind. But in a small, windowless room on the island of Oahu, someone was listening. Even as Yamamoto's ships slipped away from Japanese harbors under the cover of darkness, a quiet battle was unfolding inside the cryptographic heart of the Pacific. At a place called Station Hypo, American codebreakers had been working day and night to decipher Japanese naval communications. And slowly, painfully, a name kept appearing: AF. No one knew exactly what it meant. But Commander Joseph Rockefford had a gut feeling. It meant Midway. He proposed a simple, brilliant ruse. Send an uncoded message from Midway about a water shortage. If Japanese intercepts later referenced water problems at AF, then it was proof. Proof that Midway was the next target. And the trap worked. The Japanese bit. Their response came quickly. AF is short on water. That was it. All the confirmation the Americans needed. And just like that, Yamamoto's great deception, his masterstroke, was pierced. The Americans knew what was coming, and they were going to be ready. But Yamamoto had no idea. To him, the pieces were still in place. He believed surprise was on his side. He believed the Americans would walk blindly into his net. And he believed, as the date of battle neared, that victory would be swift and total. He studied his carrier commanders with pride. Men like Vice Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike. Their aircraft were seasoned, their tactics refined. Morale was high. Japanese pilots, trained in fierce discipline and drilled to near perfection, believed themselves unbeatable. And for good reason. They had won every battle since Pearl Harbor. From the Philippines to the Coral Sea, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. But Yamamoto worried. Not about his men, not about their skill, but about fate. He once wrote to a colleague, "In the first 6 months to a year of war with the United States and Great Britain, I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." It was not humility. It was prediction, and it was already coming true. Because while Japan was still riding the high of conquest, America was transforming. Factories were running 24 hours a day. Liberty ships were rolling off assembly lines. New aircraft carriers were being completed in months. American industrial might, the sleeping giant Yamamoto feared, was stirring to life. Tom was no longer on his side. He also knew that Japanese logistics were stretched thin. Fuel was running low. Experienced pilots couldn't be replaced fast enough. Every battle, every mission, was eroding Japan's strength, not just in ships, but in blood. But there was no turning back. Midway had already been set in motion. Carriers were steaming toward their positions. Bombers were being armed, codebooks distributed, and Yamamoto, the master planner, was watching the pieces fall into place, unaware that a mirror image was forming across the Pacific. In Washington, Admiral Chester Nimitz was moving carriers into position. Yorktown, damaged but not destroyed at the Coral Sea, was patched up in just 3 days and sent back into the fight. Alongside her, Enterprise and Hornet, 3 American carriers, versus 4 Japanese. It was a mismatch, on paper, but it wasn't paper that decided battles. It was resolve, courage, timing, and fate. As Yamamoto finalized his orders, somewhere far ahead of him, American pilots were strapping into their cockpits. Mechanics were fueling planes under the glow of red battle lamps. Crews aboard Midway were digging in, building sandbag walls, checking anti-aircraft guns, writing final letters. And in the middle of the Pacific, under skies so wide they could swallow fleets whole, 2 navies were now drifting toward the same point. They couldn't see each other yet, but they would, soon. And when they did, the fate of the Pacific would no longer rest in strategy, but in fire. Because Yamamoto's perfect plan, his bold gamble, his elegant trap, was about to be sprung. But not in the way he imagined. Chapter 3, America's Bleeding Front. A black pillar of smoke rose from the twisted remains of what had once been a warship. The taste of oil and salt hung heavy in the air, thick as grief. In the early hours of December 8, 1941, the Pacific had become a graveyard. Pearl Harbor had barely stopped burning, and yet already, a new horror had begun. Wake Island, lonely, wind-scoured, and barely known to the American public, was under siege. Japanese bombers screamed across the sky like birds of prey. The men stationed there, 189 Marines, aided by civilian contractors and a few hastily trained aviators, fought back with everything they had. And for a moment, just a moment, they held. But this was not a one-off attack. It was part of something far more vast, an empire-wide tidal wave designed to drown the Pacific. From the first moments after Pearl Harbor, Japan moved with terrifying speed. Its ambition was clear: take the entire Pacific while America still reeled. Before the industrial might of Detroit could churn out bombers. Before the youth of Iowa and Georgia could be drafted and trained. Before Washington could organize its shock into strategy. In Southeast Asia, the Philippines became the next bleeding wound. On the island of Luzon, General Douglas MacArthur, decorated, charismatic, and fiercely proud, watched helplessly as his airfields were turned to fire. Despite warnings, his planes had not been moved. Nearly every American bomber was destroyed on the ground, their silver wings twisted like tinfoil in the heat. Japanese forces landed soon after, with surgical precision. They came not with brute force alone, but with cunning. They bypassed strongholds. They attacked where defenses were soft. Their aircraft controlled the sky. Their tanks rolled across open plains, and their soldiers, hardened by years of brutal warfare in China, moved like shadows through the jungles. MacArthur's troops, Filipino regulars and American volunteers, fought bravely. But they were underfed, undertrained, and undermanned. Forced to retreat, they fell back toward Bataan and Corregidor, digging in for what would become a long and painful siege. Thousands of miles away, in the steamy jungles of British Malaya, another front collapsed. The British, confident in their colonial superiority, had built up Singapore as the ultimate fortress. Naval guns pointed out to sea. The assumption was that no enemy would dare approach from land. But the Japanese did. They stormed through Thailand on bicycles, cutting through rubber plantations, roads, and British pride with ruthless efficiency. In just 70 days, the seemingly impregnable fortress of Singapore fell. It was the largest surrender in British military history. More than 80,000 troops, Australian, Indian, and British, were marched into captivity. Churchill called it the worst disaster ever to befall British arms. And for Japan, it was vindication. The rising sun now cast its light across most of Southeast Asia. In the Pacific, Guam was overrun. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. Thailand, coerced by diplomacy and threats, joined the Japanese cause. Burma buckled. The Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and rubber, became the next target, and the Japanese Navy swept in with force. Everywhere, the same pattern unfolded: a precision strike from the air, lightning-fast landings, and rapid consolidation. Japan was not merely winning. It was dominating. Its Zero fighters outmaneuvered American aircraft. Its battleships prowled confidently. Its soldiers believed they were carrying out the will of the emperor himself. And still, Wake Island held. For 15 days, the garrison fought back. They sank ships. They shot down bombers. They became heroes on the front pages of American newspapers. But by December 23rd, it was over. Reinforcements had not come. Supplies had run dry. The Japanese returned, this time with a larger fleet, and the defenders were overwhelmed. Those who survived were taken prisoner. Some would be executed without trial. Others were sent to labor camps. Their names faded into the noise of war, but their resistance lit a small candle of hope in a nation consumed by darkness. Across the Pacific, American forces were battered and broken. The idea of a swift counterattack vanished. In its place came a grim truth. This was going to be a long, brutal fight. On Bataan, the situation deteriorated. Food ran low. Disease spread. Malaria and dysentery became as deadly as bullets. Soldiers boiled shoe leather for soup. Ammunition was rationed. Air support was gone. The Japanese advanced slowly but surely. The Americans and Filipinos dug trenches and prayed. And yet Washington had little to offer. The Navy was crippled. The Pacific Fleet's battleships lay at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. Only the aircraft carriers had escaped, and they were now the fragile backbone of U.S. strategy. President Roosevelt ordered America to rally, but victory was still just a word. Factories in the Midwest were converting. Car plants turned to tank plants. Typewriter companies now built rifles, but it would take time. Time America did not have. The Japanese, meanwhile, moved on to the next target. Rabaul, New Britain, the Solomon Islands. Fortress after fortress, outpost after outpost, crumbled. The Pacific looked like a map drawn in red ink. And in every conquered territory, Japan planted its flag with ceremonial precision. At home, American mothers stared at telegrams. Sons missing, husbands captured, names that echoed from the radio with cold finality. Small towns held their breath. Big cities lit war bonds posters. Newspapers offered maps and patriotic slogans, but behind them, the grief was real. Yet in Tokyo, Admiral Isuroku Yamamoto remained uneasy. His daring had paid off. His vision, a first strike to break America's will, was bearing fruit. But he knew this was not over. He knew America. He had studied there. He had seen its factories, its resolve, its endless manpower. He feared what would happen when those factories roared to life. He knew that victory in war is not only about speed. It is about what happens when the first momentum is gone, when your enemy, bloodied but alive, begins to push back. The bleeding front had stretched across the Pacific, from the Hawaiian Islands to the South China Sea, from the beaches of Luzon to the jungles of Burma. It was a front without borders, a conflict without pause. But the tide of history does not stop. And as the calendar turned to the spring of 1942, something began to shift. The United States, though still reeling, had not broken. And a tiny, lonely island called Midway, just over 1,000 miles from Pearl Harbor, stood in the crosshairs. The Japanese believed one final blow would end America's naval resistance. They didn't know that America had been listening. They didn't know about the cryptographers in Hawaii, or the trap that was being set beneath the waves. The bleeding would soon stop. And at Midway, the Empire's momentum would meet its reckoning. Chapter 4, Midway, Tiny Island, Huge Stakes. A single bomb dropped from the sky could decide the fate of a continent. A handful of planes, launched from fragile wooden decks, might determine the future of millions. It was a gamble with the highest stakes imaginable, fought over a tiny speck of coral and sand, floating in the endless blue of the Pacific Ocean. Midway Atoll, just 6 square miles of land, would become the crossroads where empires clashed and destinies were forged. Midway wasn't much to look at. A flat island surrounded by reefs and shallow lagoons. Coconut palms swayed in the breeze. The air was heavy with salt and sweat. But its importance was anything but small. Imagine the Pacific Ocean as a vast, deadly chessboard, each island a crucial square. Midway sat near the center, like the king's castle, between the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor and the vast expanse of Asia, where Japan had been expanding aggressively. For the United States, Midway was the last outpost of defense before the heart of the Pacific. For Japan, it was a stepping stone, an opportunity to extend their reach closer to Hawaii and the American mainland. Its value came from one simple fact: aircraft. In the war raging across the Pacific, control of the skies meant control of the sea. Midway housed an airstrip, an airbase, that could launch fighter planes and bombers far beyond the island itself. It was like having a watchtower perched on the edge of the ocean, where planes could spot enemy ships, strike first, and warn friendly forces. Without Midway, the U.S. Pacific Fleet's reach was limited. With Midway, they could contest the vastness of the ocean, denying Japan free movement. To Japan, capturing Midway was not just a tactical victory. It was strategic dominance. Admiral Yamamoto believed that by taking Midway, Japan could draw out the American fleet into a trap, a place where his superior naval forces could crush it once and for all. With Midway as a forward base, Japan's carriers and battleships could refuel, repair, and launch attacks deeper into enemy territory, pushing the front lines closer to Hawaii and beyond. But Midway was no easy prize. Its reefs made landing operations difficult. Its garrison was small but determined, manned by a few hundred Marines and technicians who understood the island's weight in the war. They were tasked with more than just defense. They maintained vital radio stations, weather observation posts, and early warning systems, tiny threads woven into a vast network of intelligence. For those Marines, Midway was a lonely outpost at the edge of the world. Letters home were sparse. Supplies arrived irregularly. The heat was unrelenting. Every day, they prepared for the possibility of attack, knowing that their tiny island might become the scene of the greatest naval battle in history. But why Midway? Why not strike elsewhere? The answer lay in geography and technology. The Pacific Ocean is immense, more than 60 million square miles. Tracking enemy fleets was like searching for a needle in a hurricane. Aircraft carriers, the new queens of naval warfare, were powerful but vulnerable. They depended on planes for offense and defense. The farther they were from friendly air bases, the more dangerous it became to operate. Midway was a crucial midpoint, enabling American aircraft to patrol vast stretches of ocean, to strike at approaching enemies, and to protect the vital sea lanes. Moreover, Midway was more than just an airstrip. It was a communications hub, a listening post. The radio operators and codebreakers on Midway intercepted Japanese transmissions. Their reports filtered back to command centers thousands of miles away. In this invisible battle of signals and secrets, Midway was a key piece. For the Japanese, this made the island a threat that had to be neutralized. The plan was bold. Japan would launch a two-pronged attack. One force would feint an invasion of the Aleutian Islands, drawing American attention northward. The main force would strike Midway, destroy its airfield, and seize control. This would force the U.S. Navy to respond. And once the American fleet revealed its position, Yamamoto's carriers would spring the trap. But such a plan relied on timing, on secrecy, on flawless execution. The men on Midway, mostly young Marines barely out of training, were unaware of the colossal chess game unfolding around them. They repaired runways, maintained anti-aircraft guns, and scanned the horizon every dawn and dusk. Letters home spoke of heat, boredom, and the strange beauty of isolation. Yet, behind their quiet routines, tension simmered. These were the sentinels on the front line of history. Across thousands of miles in Washington, D.C., military leaders knew that the battle for Midway was coming. Thanks to breakthroughs in code breaking, American intelligence had begun to unravel Japanese plans. But uncertainty remained. Where exactly would the attack come? How strong was the enemy? How long could Midway hold against a full-scale assault? The stakes were immense. If Midway fell, the Pacific would be open to Japan's forces, Hawaii would be vulnerable, and the American ability to project power across the ocean would be crippled. The war's momentum, which had so far favored Japan, would be reinforced. The sense of urgency crackled in every command room, every briefing. Yet, if Midway held, if the Americans could surprise the Japanese, if luck and courage favored the defenders, then the tide of war might turn. And all this would come down to a handful of islands and a few thousand men caught in the middle. As the sun rose and set over Midway, its coral sands bore silent witness to the invisible storm gathering overhead. From decks of aircraft carriers, planes were being armed, fueled, and readied. Messages crackled in code. Commanders stared at maps, their faces tight with concentration. The ocean itself seemed to hold its breath. On the island, the men gazed at the endless horizon, unaware that the moment of reckoning was near. Their small outpost, this forgotten piece of earth, would soon be the stage where empires collided, lives were lost, and the course of history was decided. But in war, even the smallest place can carry the heaviest burden, and Midway was about to bear that burden like no other. The battle for control of the Pacific was no longer a distant threat. It was here. It was now. And the world was watching, waiting for the outcome that would echo through generations. Because in the vast expanse of the ocean, a tiny island held the key to everything. And whoever controlled Midway controlled the future. Chapter 5. The Codebreakers of Station Hypo. In a small, dimly lit room on the island of Oahu, far from the roar of battleships and the thunder of planes, a different kind of war was being fought. A war of whispers, shadows, and secrets. The clatter of typewriters mixed with the low murmur of voices, and the sharp scratch of pencils tracing coded messages. This was Station Hypo, the nerve center of U.S. Navy cryptography in the Pacific. Here, a handful of brilliant, determined men waged a battle that could tip the scales of the entire war. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle with pieces scattered across the world, while the enemy constantly changes the picture. The Japanese Navy's secret codes were among the most complex in the world, a tangled web of symbols, numbers, and shifting keys designed to keep their plans hidden beneath layers of confusion. To crack them was to find the enemy's heartbeat, to hear their footsteps in the dark before they struck. For months, the cryptographers at Station Hypo had been locked in this invisible struggle. At the center of this effort was Commander Joseph Rockefford, a man with a sharp mind, a quick wit, and an unshakable belief that his team could unravel the mystery of Japan's next move. Rockefford wasn't a soldier on the front lines. He didn't command ships or planes. But he held something equally powerful, the key to knowing the enemy's plans before they unfolded. And then came the code. Japanese messages were being intercepted daily, streams of characters sent across the airwaves, thought to be indecipherable. But slowly, piece by piece, the cryptographers began to see patterns, hints, and repeats. Among the jumble was a curious reference to a mysterious place labeled only as AF. No one knew what AF was. Was it an island? A code name for a fleet? A city? It was a puzzle wrapped in an enigma. The stakes were unimaginably high. If the Americans guessed wrong, the enemy's attack would come as a thunderbolt, as devastating as Pearl Harbor. But if they guessed right, they could set a trap. They could prepare. They could fight back. To test their theory, Rockefford proposed a bold experiment, a risky gamble that blurred the line between intelligence and deception. They sent an uncoded message from Midway, deliberately reporting that the island's water supply was low. They broadcasted this message openly, knowing the Japanese would intercept it. It was like leaving a secret note in plain sight, daring the enemy to read it. Days passed. Then, a reply came. The Japanese broadcasted a message confirming AF was short on water. It was the proof Rockefford and his team had prayed for. AF was Midway. With this revelation, the Americans could prepare for the assault that was coming. They could position their carriers, ready their planes, and steel their defenses. What had been a secret became an open secret. But this victory was not without cost. The work in Station Hypo was grueling. The cryptographers labored under pressure, often through long nights, working on a shoestring budget with few resources. Many were young men, driven by a mix of patriotism, curiosity, and the heavy burden of knowing that a single mistake could mean death for thousands. Rockefford himself had a rough, unpolished demeanor, sometimes clashing with the Navy's upper ranks. His team was small, underappreciated, and often overlooked. Yet, their discoveries saved lives, changed strategies, and shifted the momentum of the war. Every intercepted message was a heartbeat of the enemy's plan. Every decoded word a step closer to victory or disaster. And as the Japanese fleet steamed toward Midway, unaware their secret was uncovered, the tension in that quiet Hawaiian room grew. The men waited, listened, and prepared, knowing that soon, the fate of the Pacific would hinge on what they had uncovered. But the battle was far from over. Because knowing the enemy's plan was only the first step. The real challenge was surviving what was to come. And so, the codebreakers of Station Hypo held their breath, as history prepared to be made. Chapter 6, Operation MI, Japan's Grand Ambush. The sun rose slowly over the Pacific, its golden light spilling across endless waves, quiet, indifferent, eternal. But beneath that serene surface, forces were moving. Ships, aircraft, men, all part of a colossal game being played in silence. And at the center of this game was one man, Admiral Isuroku Yamamoto. He had seen war before. He had studied in America, walked its streets, understood its people, and feared its power. He knew that Japan's only chance of winning the Pacific War was to land a blow so devastating, so complete, that the Americans would lose the will to fight. And so, he devised a masterpiece of naval strategy. A grand ambush. A trap cloaked in distance, deception, and overconfidence. He called it Operation MI. Midway Atoll, a tiny speck on the map. Just two small islands, no bigger than a dot in the Pacific vastness. But its location gave it power. From Midway, bombers could reach Pearl Harbor. From Midway, Japan could threaten the very heart of American control in the Pacific. Yamamoto's plan was simple in concept, but impossibly complex in execution. Take Midway, draw the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle, and annihilate it once and for all. He believed that the Americans, still licking their wounds from Pearl Harbor and desperate to defend their last line in the Central Pacific, would be forced to respond. And when they did, when they sent their precious aircraft carriers to defend Midway, he would be waiting. With 4 carriers. With hundreds of planes. With battleships lurking behind, ready to crush whatever survived. But to lure the Americans into the trap, he needed misdirection. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands, far to the north, would scatter the Americans' attention. It was a feint. One arm of the Japanese fleet would strike Alaska, drawing away precious carriers. Meanwhile, the real blow would fall on Midway, swiftly and overwhelmingly. Yamamoto broke his forces into several groups, something risky in naval warfare, especially across such vast distances. His main body, including the massive battleship Yamato, would remain far to the rear. The first mobile force, the WWII, Japan's 4 elite carriers, would strike Midway directly. Then came the invasion force, loaded with troops to occupy the atoll once it was neutralized. A picket line of submarines was deployed to screen and detect any movement from Pearl Harbor. It was a grand illusion, layers upon layers of moving parts. Each group moving like gears in a watch, all timed precisely. If it worked, it would cripple the U.S. Navy and give Japan control of the Pacific. But there was a problem. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, the Americans had already cracked part of Japan's naval code. Station Hypo, an elite team of U.S. Navy cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rockefford, had intercepted and decrypted key messages from the Japanese Navy. The code name, AF, kept appearing in the transmissions. And through a clever trick involving a fake water shortage message, they confirmed it. AF was Midway. With this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz made a bold choice. He would not fall into the trap. Instead, he would set his own. Nimitz positioned 3 carriers, the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, near Midway. They would lie in wait, hidden, silent, like daggers in the dark. The Japanese believed the Yorktown was sunk after the Battle of the Coral Sea. They had no idea she had limped back to Pearl Harbor, been patched together in just 3 days, and was already sailing back out to sea. Her decks still bore the scars of fire and bombs, but her crew was ready. Meanwhile, at Midway itself, the island braced for impact. Every man on the atoll knew what was coming. Pilots practiced takeoffs. Bombers were loaded. Anti-aircraft guns were dug in. The coral airstrips shimmered under the heat, waiting for the battle to begin. Every American there understood that they were the shield, that if Midway fell, Hawaii could be next. And aboard the Japanese carriers, the mood was calm, even confident. On Akagi's flight deck, pilots went through drills. Mechanics checked engines. Bombs were hoisted into bays. There was no sense of doom, only expectation. These were the same pilots who had struck Pearl Harbor, who had swept across the Pacific in a wave of destruction. They believed they were invincible, but their confidence hit a terrible vulnerability. Because the Americans were no longer guessing. They weren't reacting blindly. They were prepared. Yamamoto's plan depended on surprise, on secrecy, on perfect timing. But the ocean is vast, and radios cannot be silenced forever. His forces were spread too thin. His submarines arrived late. And the very strategy that made Operation MI so elegant made it dangerously fragile. He did not know that 3 American carriers were already in position. He did not know that Midway's defenders had dug in deep. He did not know that every piece of the puzzle was visible to the enemy. And so, as the sun rose on June 4, 1942, the trap Yamamoto had spent months preparing was about to be sprung, not by him, but against him. All his fleets were in motion. His carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru, were approaching from the northwest. The invasion fleet followed. And far behind, hidden by hundreds of miles, the main body waited, its massive guns silent. But there would be no decisive surface engagement. This was not going to be the battle Yamamoto had imagined. What he didn't know, what none of the Japanese commanders knew, was that within hours, the skies above Midway would become a firestorm. That bombs and torpedoes would fall like rain. That ships would burn. That men would scream, fight, and die in seconds. That 4 of Japan's elite carriers, the very heart of its naval power, were sailing toward oblivion. Operation MI was a masterpiece of strategy. But like all masterpieces, it depended on illusion. And when illusion shatters, reality bites hard. The Japanese fleet was still confident, still sailing forward, still unaware. And the American carriers were waiting in silence. Engines idling, flight decks full, bombs armed. The battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific was now just hours away. The trap was set, and it was about to snap shut. Chapter 7, Admiral Nimitz's Gamble. The water was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before the storm. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steamed toward Midway Island, confident, disciplined, and unaware. On paper, they were unstoppable. They had destroyed Pearl Harbor. They had sunk the British battleship Prince of Wales. They had taken the Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. Every fleet that had stood against them had either retreated or vanished beneath the waves. And now, they were coming for Midway. But this time, something was different. Someone was waiting. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood alone with the weight of a nation on his shoulders. Pearl Harbor still smoldered in memory. The American people were still reeling, desperate for hope. And here he was, just 6 months into the war, planning to send what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into what could only be described as a trap. And yet, he had a hunch based on scraps of code. It started with a mystery, a radio code the Japanese used, AF. The Americans had seen it before, buried inside intercepted messages. It was supposed to be a location, but which one? Nimitz wasn't a codebreaker, but he listened to the ones who were. And among them was Commander Joseph Rockefford, a brilliant, eccentric officer who wore bathrobes to work, chewed on cigars, and barely slept. He and his team at Station Hypo were obsessively listening, decoding, comparing message fragments that came in drips and whispers. And Rockefford was sure. AF meant Midway. But Nimitz had to be sure. There were lives at stake. Ships. Planes. The entire defense of the Pacific. So he let Rockefford run an experiment. Have Midway send an unencrypted radio message pretending that their water distillation plant was broken. Days later, a Japanese message came through. AF reports low on water. That was the confirmation. It was Midway. And so began the gamble. Nimitz moved quickly. He had to. He ordered every available ship into action. The Yorktown, badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, was hauled into Pearl Harbor like a wounded animal. Repair crews worked around the clock, 72 hours without rest, to patch the ship just enough to make it seaworthy. She would go to Midway with bandaged hulls and barely functioning equipment, like a boxer returning to the ring with broken ribs. Then came the positioning. Nimitz didn't have enough ships to go toe-to-toe with the Japanese head-on. He had to outthink them, outsmart them. While Admiral Yamamoto believed the U.S. fleet was still licking its wounds, Nimitz hid his carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, where the Japanese wouldn't expect them. He was playing a game of shadows, preparing to strike from an angle no one saw coming. But the stakes were terrifying. He was risking almost everything he had left. He was gambling on decoded messages, on faith in his people, on timing, on weather. He was placing the entire Pacific strategy in the hands of pilots barely out of training, commanders still learning on the job, and carriers patched together with hope and steel. And if he was wrong, if the Japanese changed course, or if the codebreakers had misread a single line, the U.S. Navy could be wiped out in a single blow. To understand the scale of that risk, imagine playing poker. Now imagine that every chip on the table is a warship. Every card in your hand is an intercepted radio message. And across from you is Yamamoto, a man with more ships, more experience, and a proven record of victory. And you? You're bluffing. Nimitz wasn't reckless. He was calculated. He had learned from the loss at Pearl Harbor that waiting and reacting wasn't enough. He had to act first, boldly, decisively. And so, he turned Midway into a fortress. He rushed fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes to the island. He dug in its defenses. He readied the island's radar and communications. He even made sure extra fuel and munitions were stockpiled. It was no longer just a target. It was bait. And the carriers? They would be the knife waiting in the dark. But none of this guaranteed victory. Because war, no matter how well planned, is chaos. Pilots would miss their targets. Ships would sink. Men would die. And if just one piece of the puzzle fell out of place, if the Japanese spotted the American carriers first, it would be over. June approached. The messages kept coming. Japanese ships were moving. And yet, Nimitz couldn't see them, couldn't touch them, only believe. On June 3rd, a Catalina flying boat spotted the Japanese invasion fleet heading toward Midway. Not the carriers yet, just troop transports. But it was confirmation. They were coming. Nimitz's hand trembled slightly as he signed off on the final deployment orders. The carriers steamed into position. Pilots were briefed. Torpedoes were loaded. And still, no one knew where the enemy's carriers were. Then silence. Hours passed. Then a day. Radio silence. No eyes on the fleet. No word from the scouts. Just the open ocean, stretching endlessly in all directions. Some doubted. Some whispered that it was a mistake. That maybe the Japanese had changed their minds. That maybe they were striking elsewhere. But Nimitz remained still. Watching. Waiting. And on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the Japanese launched their first attack on Midway. Bombs fell. Buildings burned. But Nimitz didn't blink. Because what Yamamoto didn't know, what none of the Japanese knew, was that just over the horizon, hidden by clouds and waves, 3 American carriers were waiting. Engines were warming. Pilots were climbing into cockpits. Flight decks were alive with activity. Radios crackled. Spotters scanned the skies. The trap was ready. The hunter was about to become the hunted. And as the sun climbed above the Pacific, the Battle of Midway began, not with a roar, but with a decision. A decision made weeks earlier by one man, standing in Pearl Harbor, looking at a map, and choosing to believe the whispers of a codebreaker in a bathrobe. The gamble had begun. Now the world would find out if it would pay off, or cost America the Pacific. Chapter 8, Fortress Midway. The sea was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses in on a man's chest, as if the ocean itself is holding its breath. Somewhere in the haze and salt, American Marines dug deeper into the coral sand, scanning the horizon for a fleet they couldn't yet see, but knew was coming. The air was thick, not with humidity, but tension. One island, no bigger than a speck on most maps, stood between the rising sun of Japan and the heart of America's Pacific defense. Midway was no longer a forgotten outpost. It was a fortress now, or at least, they hoped it was strong enough to be one. Midway Atoll, just two tiny islands, Sand and Eastern, sitting in the blue vastness of the Pacific, had become America's front line. Before, it was a remote naval base, a dot halfway between Asia and the West Coast. Now, it was the bait in Admiral Nimitz's plan to turn the tide of the Pacific War. And that bait needed teeth. Dark clouds bruised the sky as the island braced for war. On the small speck of coral in the vast Pacific, sweat dripped from the brows of Marines, construction workers, and Navy men alike. Their hands were blistered, their nerves frayed, but their mission was clear: turn Midway into an unsinkable fortress before the enemy arrived. Time was bleeding away. Somewhere out there, the Japanese fleet was coming. Fast. Weeks earlier, Nimitz had made a gamble, one based entirely on whispers between codebreakers and radio signals from Japan. He trusted them, and now, he needed to make this rocky outpost ready to withstand the full weight of the Empire of Japan. Supplies came fast, ferried in on transport ships, and dropped from the sky. Engineers swarmed across the coral, laying down airstrips like veins of steel. Huge slabs of pierced steel planking rattled beneath their boots, stretching out into runways that would host fighters, bombers, and patrol planes. Every inch of ground was carved and shaped to serve one purpose: resistance. The men dug trenches by hand, hacking through the coral with pickaxes. Bunkers, made from sandbags and concrete, rose like jagged scars across the island. Anti-aircraft guns sprouted from hidden emplacements. Radar towers stretched into the sky like skeletal arms. The Marines knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched. But they weren't out of time. Not yet. Major General Clarence L. Tinker watched as planes screamed overhead. Some of them barely made it off the new runways. The air was thick with diesel fumes, fear, and salt. His pilots, mostly young boys from Kansas and California, tried to mask their nerves with jokes and cigarettes. But even the bravest among them knew they were standing in the path of a storm. The island's defenders included every branch: Navy, Army, Marines, and Coast Guard. Over 3,000 men. Some were hardened veterans. Others had never seen a real enemy before. But they worked shoulder to shoulder, welding steel, unloading ammo, and training in the sweltering heat. Every man knew the truth: this island might not survive. But if it held, the war could change. Even the wildlife was disturbed. Albatrosses screamed over the runways. Crabs scuttled away from boot steps. Beneath it all, the sea murmured in its ancient rhythm, indifferent to the drama unfolding on land. Radar was a new weapon then, unproven, fragile. But Midway had it, and the operators trained day and night, scanning the skies for the first blips that would signal an incoming attack. It was like watching ghosts crawl across a green screen, hoping one of those echoes wasn't your death coming in fast. Fuel tanks were buried underground. Ammunition was stockpiled in hollowed-out recesses. Hospitals were prepped for mass casualties. The chapel held more men than ever, prayers mixing with the rumble of engines. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The Japanese were coming, and when they arrived, they would bring fire. The men slept in shifts. Some barely slept at all. The nights were full of hammering and shouting, engines and alarms. On the horizon, the dark shape of war drew closer. Midway was becoming something else. Less an island, more a trigger. Pilots ran drills, taking off and landing until the steel beneath their wheels blistered in the sun. Anti-aircraft crews trained with live rounds, their fingers raw from handling shells. Discipline was tight, morale tighter. There was no margin for error. Scouts flew long-range missions daily, scanning for signs of the enemy. Every ripple in the ocean, every shape in the clouds brought suspicion. And then, finally, a coded message crackled through the air. The Japanese were on the move. The trap was set. The bait was ready. Now, the waiting was over. June 3rd, 1942, the enemy was here. And Midway, for all its coral, steel, and sweat, would soon be tested in the fire of battle. A fortress not by stone, but by will. By dawn, the Pacific would bleed. Chapter 9. Resurrecting the Yorktown. The USS Yorktown was dying. Her decks were torn apart, hull cracked, and crew scattered, wounded, exhausted, and hearts full of fear. Just days earlier, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, she had taken the kind of beating that usually sent ships to the bottom. Fires had raged across her flight deck, ruptured fuel lines had flooded compartments, and explosions had rocked her steel bones. Even the most optimistic estimates gave her weeks, maybe months, before she could ever see open water again. And yet, time was the one thing Admiral Chester Nimitz didn't have. The Japanese fleet was coming. Fast. In the dark, smoke-scarred belly of Pearl Harbor, a miracle was about to unfold. This is the story of how a crippled warship, written off by nearly everyone, was reborn in just 72 hours, 3 days, by sheer willpower, grit, and human ingenuity. This wasn't just a tale of machines and tools. It was a story of sweat-soaked overalls, busted knuckles, midnight oil, and the defiant belief that the impossible could be done. At Pier 4, the Yorktown pulled in slowly, groaning, wounded. Her flight deck had a massive hole punched through it, electrical systems were down, boilers damaged, and she leaked fuel like a sieve. Normally, repairs like this would take 90 days at least. That was the Navy standard. But Nimitz gave them 3. 3. Not weeks. Days. The order sounded like madness. But in that chaos, he saw something else. He saw an opportunity to tip the balance in what would become one of the most decisive battles in naval history. Nimitz wasn't a gambler by nature. But this was the bet of a lifetime. The Japanese were sailing with confidence, expecting to catch the Americans off guard at Midway. Nimitz intended to surprise them instead, with Yorktown. The workers at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard didn't waste a second. Within hours, over 1,000 men had swarmed the carrier like ants on a wounded beast. Welders threw up sparks that lit the night like fireflies. Electricians worked by flashlight, hands trembling with fatigue but refusing to stop. Engineers crawled into the deepest guts of the ship, patching steam lines and sealing ruptures with whatever they could find. They weren't just fixing metal, they were resurrecting hope. There was no sleep, no margin for error, no room for failure. Food was delivered to the workers on deck. Men rotated in shifts, so someone was always drilling, welding, hammering. By the second day, the air was thick with smoke, sweat, and noise, a kind of organized chaos that only happens when everyone knows the clock is ticking louder with every heartbeat. Chief petty officers barked orders while their own hands bled from the work. Sailors who had served on Yorktown refused to rest. They stayed to help, haunted by the idea that their ship might not return to fight. One machinist's mate later said, "It was like watching a loved one in surgery. We didn't know if she'd make it, but we had to try." Even the docks became extensions of the ship. Giant cranes whirled through the air, lowering replacement parts that had been cannibalized from other vessels. Nothing was sacred. If a working generator was needed, another ship would give it up. This wasn't just one repair job. It was a national effort condensed into a few football fields of steel and fire. And somehow it worked. 72 hours after limping into port, the USS Yorktown pulled away from the dock under her own power. Still battered, still bruised, but alive. She could sail. She could launch planes. She could fight. But the damage beneath her decks ran deeper than metal. The crew knew what they were sailing into. The Pacific was about to erupt again. And this time, they were heading straight into the teeth of it. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the task force commander, stepped back aboard Yorktown with grim resolve. The ship, still smelling of burnt metal and fresh paint, groaned as if waking from a coma. Her flight deck crews ran drills, pilots checked their planes, and damage control teams triple-checked every line and seal. They knew that the Japanese were coming with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru, each brimming with experienced pilots and war-tested aircraft. Yorktown would be one of only 3 American carriers standing in their way. The odds were brutal. The margin for error, non-existent. But Yorktown wasn't just steel and engines anymore. She was a symbol, a middle finger to defeat. A reminder that Americans didn't just repair things, they resurrected them. That when cornered, they didn't fold, they fought back. As the sun dipped below the horizon on June 3rd, Yorktown and her escorting ships steamed toward destiny. Her decks silent for a moment, her engines humming low, as if the sea itself held its breath. The miracle of her return was complete. But would it be enough? Because ahead, hidden somewhere across the waves, was the most powerful carrier strike force the world had ever seen, led by Admiral Nagumo, a man with blood in his eyes and fire on his decks. And the battle for Midway was just about to begin. Chapter 10, Japan's Aleutian Diversion. The wind howled like a ghost's lament across the cold, barren Aleutian Islands. Rain sliced through the gray skies, the ocean roiling beneath with angry swells. Far from the tropical heat of Midway, this remote stretch of volcanic rock and frozen tundra was about to become a stage for a high-stakes deception, a calculated move in a deadly chess game. It was June 3rd, 1942. As the men on Midway waited, tension tightening like a coiled spring, a shadow fleet sailed stealthily northward under the cloak of storms. The Japanese Imperial Navy was launching a 2-pronged attack. While most eyes focused on the small coral atoll, the Empire sent aircraft carriers and warships toward the Illusian chain, aiming to seize the islands of Attu and Kiska. To most Americans, the Aleutians were a forgotten stretch of wilderness, harsh and inhospitable. But to Admiral Isuroku Yamamoto, they were a perfect distraction, an elegant ruse designed to pull the American fleet's attention away from Midway, the true prize. The idea was simple, but brilliant in its audacity. Create confusion, force the enemy to divide forces, and then strike the decisive blow. The plan unfolded under stormy skies as Japanese bombers roared over Dutch Harbor, a small U.S. outpost on Unalaska Island. Explosions shattered the silence, shrapnel rained down on hastily dug foxholes, and buildings erupted in fire. American defenders scrambled, their anti-aircraft guns rattling into life. Pilots in outdated fighters raced to intercept, their engines straining against the cold winds. The attack stunned the defenders. For a moment, it seemed the Aleutian strike might be the main assault, the true focus of Japan's expansive campaign. The specter of Japanese forces on American soil sparked alarm in Washington and beyond. Yet, in the command center at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz remained calm. Thanks to the tireless work of the codebreakers, men who had cracked the secrets of the Japanese naval code Jan. 25, Nimitz knew the truth. The Aleutian attack was a feint, a diversion meant to mislead. The heart of Japan's strike force still aimed for Midway. Nimitz's steady resolve was as much a weapon as any battleship. Unlike many who might have been rattled by the northern attack, he held his course. He kept his carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the miraculously repaired Yorktown, focused on the trap set near Midway. The gamble was enormous. Ignore an assault on American soil to win a battle that could turn the tide of the entire Pacific War. Meanwhile, in the freezing Aleutian archipelago, American forces fought a desperate defense. Dutch Harbor's anti-aircraft batteries barked into the fog, while scattered fighter planes engaged in dogfights over rocky cliffs and icy waters. The Japanese landed troops on Attu and Kiska, marking the first enemy occupation of American territory since the War of 1812. The psychological shock was profound, a stark reminder that the war was truly global. Yet the Illusian campaign was a costly distraction for the Japanese. The harsh weather, rough seas, and supply difficulties slowed their advance. The rugged terrain proved unforgiving to invaders and defenders alike. And most critically, it failed to divert Nimitz's attention from Midway. This was the fatal flaw in Yamamoto's design. His plan underestimated not only American resolve, but the precision of U.S. intelligence. The Codebreakers' work turned deception into clarity, turning chaos into a map that allowed Nimitz to hold firm. Back on Midway, the men dug trenches with grim determination, loaded guns with painstaking care, and fueled aircraft for the battle they knew was imminent. Pilots checked weapons, studied maps, and steeled themselves for what lay ahead. They understood this was more than a battle. It was a test of survival, of national will. Far across the Pacific, the Japanese fleet approached, unaware that their diversion had failed. Their confidence was high, their plans meticulous. But the trap was set. The bait was ready. The Aleutian skies, wild and unyielding, whispered a cold truth. Sometimes, the loudest storm is just a distraction from the real battle raging silently elsewhere. And as the sun set on June 3, 1942, the fate of the Pacific rested on a razor's edge. What followed would echo through history and change the world forever. Chapter 11, June 3, Enemy in Sight. The first light of dawn was barely brushing the endless Pacific when an urgent message shattered the tense calm aboard the American fleet. Enemy in sight. Bearing northwest. Multiple ships, carriers among them. The words crackled over the radio like a lifeline thrown into the fog of war. For hours, the vast ocean had been a quiet, vast expanse, deceptive in its stillness. But now, out on the horizon, a dark silhouette emerged. The Imperial Japanese Navy's invasion force, a massive armada carrying the fate of nations on steel decks and roaring engines. The men in those American patrol planes felt the crushing weight of that discovery, a mix of hope, fear, and the grim knowledge that the real battle was about to begin. Pilots in rugged, worn planes tightened their grips on controls, hearts pounding as adrenaline surged. They were the eyes of the fleet, tasked with locating the enemy before the enemy found them. The sun had just begun to cast its pale light when the first waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes took off from Midway and the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. These were men who had trained for this moment, but now faced the terrifying uncertainty of battle. Many were barely out of their teens. Some carried tokens from home, a photograph, a letter, a small trinket, tucked close, a talisman against death. Their voices, when they spoke, were tight with tension, yet beneath the fear burned a fierce determination. The planes streaked through the sky like arrows, engines screaming, eyes fixed on the distant fleet. But the Japanese were no easy target. Their ships moved with disciplined precision, anti-aircraft guns opening up with thunderous fury, sending trails of smoke and flak into the air. Despite their bravery, the American attacks failed to hit their marks. Bombs fell short or wide. Torpedoes veered off in the churning seas. Some pilots returned with bullet-riddled planes, their bodies battered, spirits weighed down by the bitter sting of near misses and lost chances. Back on the flight decks, mechanics and crews braced for their wounded. Some rushed to patch up damaged aircraft. Others whispered prayers for friends who might never return. The sense of urgency was palpable. Every missed strike was a moment lost, a chance the enemy might seize. Yet amidst the chaos, there was an unyielding hope. The fact that the fleet had been spotted first meant the tide could still turn. The Americans had an edge, knowledge. They knew where the enemy was, and they were preparing to strike again. On board the Yorktown, still recovering from repairs, the hum of activity was relentless. Men worked feverishly to rearm planes, check engines, and prepare for another sortie. Sweat mixed with oil as hands worked with precision born of necessity. Pilots checked their gear, their faces set in grim determination, aware that their next chance might be their last. Meanwhile, on Midway itself, the island's defenders were on edge. Marines and soldiers scanned the horizon and sky, loading artillery and readying aircraft. Every man knew the stakes. The enemy was close, and the battle for survival was imminent. The air buzzed with anticipation and dread. Communications crackled with updates, fears, and fragments of hope. This was no longer preparation. It was the first step in a deadly dance of attack and counterattack. The Japanese fleet remained unaware that their presence had been revealed. They continued their advance, confident in their power and mission. But the element of surprise had slipped from their grasp. This initial American air attack, though failing to score decisive hits, sent a clear message. The fight was underway. The defenders were ready to meet the storm. And the real battle, the one that would echo through history, was just beginning. In the moments to come, every pilot, sailor, and soldier would face choices that would define not just the outcome of a battle, but the fate of a Pacific war. The sky, now brightening, held its breath. The Pacific was ready to bleed. Chapter 12, June 4th, Midway under fire. June 4th, 1942. The faint glow of dawn barely pierced the thick veil of humid ocean mist hovering over Midway Atoll, a remote cluster of coral islands and reefs miles away from any mainland. Yet, on this day, this tiny speck in the vast Pacific Ocean was about to become the focal point of a titanic clash that would alter the course of history. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the thunderous drone of hundreds of aircraft engines cutting through the fragile morning calm. Japanese warplanes swarmed the skies above Midway, darkening the pale blue like a thick cloud of locusts descending to devour everything in their path. Midway was under fire. Below, the island's defenders scrambled amid the chaos. Marines, soldiers, pilots, mechanics, each man moved with grim purpose. Their world had narrowed to the desperate task of survival. These men faced not only enemy bombs, but the immense weight of history pressing down on their shoulders. The island itself was small, a handful of airstrips carved from coral and sand, a scattering of wooden barracks and fuel depots, but it held outsized importance. Midway was the linchpin of America's Pacific defense, a critical forward base from which the U.S. Navy could monitor enemy movements and launch counterattacks. Losing it would have opened the door for Japanese domination of the Pacific. The first Japanese bombs fell with terrible precision. Explosions tore into the coral airstrips, cracking the surface, ripping apart planes, and sending clouds of smoke and flame billowing into the sky. Barracks and supply dumps erupted in fireballs. The ground itself trembled beneath the assault, and the acrid smell of burning aviation fuel mixed with the salty ocean breeze. The island shook as if the very earth was under siege. The men defending Midway faced this inferno with whatever weapons they had. Their aircraft were aging and outmatched. Curtiss P-40 Warhawks and Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers, sturdy but slower and less maneuverable than the sleek Mitsubishi Zeros and Aichi Vals screaming toward them. Many of these planes had been hastily patched together after long months of patrols. Yet, despite their limitations, the pilots climbed into their cockpits with fierce determination. These were young men, barely out of their teens in some cases, who understood the stakes as clearly as their commanders. The survival of the island, their comrades, and perhaps the Pacific itself depended on their courage. The anti-aircraft gunners scrambled to their positions, their hands moving rapidly yet carefully as they loaded shell after shell into their cannons and machine guns. Their weapons were older models, some brought from bases across the continent, not designed for this scale of assault. Still, their firepower erupted in defiant staccato bursts, tracer rounds painting fiery arcs through the sky. These bursts of light and smoke were desperate prayers woven into the fabric of battle, a fiery barrier between the island and destruction. Many of these men fought through exhaustion and fear, gripping their guns with shaking hands, but never lowering their sights. Some gunners would later recall firing until their arms felt numb, their muscles burning, unwilling to yield even as enemy bullets tore through the air around them. Up in the sky, dogfights erupted amid the roar of engines and the rattle of machine guns. American fighters, despite being outnumbered and outclassed, lunged into combat with reckless courage. Their planes twisted and dived through clouds of flak and enemy tracers, seeking any opening to strike. Every engagement was a brutal contest of wills. The sky became a deadly dance, a desperate game of cat and mouse, where seconds decided life or death. Many pilots would never return from these missions, their planes spiraling down into the ocean or bursting into flame. On the ground, the men worked feverishly to keep the island's defenses operational. Mechanics scrambled to refuel and rearm battered planes, while engineers patched up damaged runways under the constant threat of renewed bombing. The roar of engines and explosions blended with shouted orders and the frantic clatter of boots on gravel. Communication lines crackled with tension as officers coordinated defense efforts, directing fighters, calling down artillery fire, and rallying the troops to hold the line. The human cost was immediate and staggering. Young men who had written letters home just days before now lay wounded or dead amid the ruins of their base. Their faces, frozen in photographs, tell stories of hope, fear, and determination. A pilot wounded in the leg refused to bail out, guiding his crippled plane away from friendly forces and crashing into the sea. A gunner kept firing even after shrapnel pierced his arm, his eyes locked on the enemy until he could no longer stand. Medics weaved through smoke and debris, their hands steady despite the chaos, tending to the wounded with a quiet heroism that often went unseen. The island's radar stations, the vital eyes that had given the defenders early warning, buzzed with frantic activity. Operators tracked every incoming wave of attackers and fed this information to command centers where officers made split-second decisions. This intelligence was a lifeline, a thin thread of control in a swirling storm of violence. Orders issued over crackling radios directed fighters to intercept, focused artillery fire on approaching planes, and kept the defenders coordinated despite the turmoil. But despite their bravery and tenacity, the men of Midway faced overwhelming odds. Bombs tore through buildings, runways cracked and splintered, fires raged out of control, and ammunition dwindled. The island was bleeding. Still, the spirit of its defenders was unbroken. Every moment of resistance bought precious time. Time for reinforcements to arrive, and time for the larger battle unfolding beyond the horizon. Somewhere far out at sea, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown prepared to launch their own strikes against the Japanese fleet. The bravery of the island's defenders was part of a larger, desperate gambit, a gamble that hinged on courage, skill, and a measure of luck. As the day wore on, the skies above Midway remained a chaotic tempest of fire and smoke. Each wave of Japanese aircraft brought new devastation, but each was met with fierce resistance. The defenders were battered, but unbowed. And beneath the smoke and shattered coral, a question loomed. How long could Midway hold? How many more lives would be sacrificed before the tide of war turned? The morning of June 4th was only the opening chapter of a battle that would echo through history. A battle of bravery, sacrifice, and the will to survive against overwhelming odds. Midway was burning, but it was not yet broken. The heart of the Pacific War beat fiercely on. The storm had only just begun. Chapter 13, The Torpedo Squadron's Sacrifice. June 4, 1942. The fragile Pacific dawn was barely breaking when the first American torpedo bombers rose from their carriers' decks, engines roaring into the cool morning air. The mission that awaited them was as daring as it was desperate, to strike directly at the core of the Japanese fleet, without the protection of fighter escort. The Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru were waiting, their decks bristling with aircraft and deadly anti-aircraft guns. For the men flying the Douglas TBD Devastators, this was a near-suicidal charge into the jaws of an enemy far more agile and better equipped in the skies. These planes were relics of an earlier era, slow and lumbering compared to the sleek Mitsubishi Zero fighters that prowled overhead. The Devastator was a torpedo bomber designed to fly low and slow, releasing its weapon at just the right moment. A steady, straight flight path that made the plane a perfect target. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, these pilots climbed into their cockpits with faces set in grim determination, steeling themselves for the fight ahead. Many were barely more than boys, but in their eyes burned a fierce resolve, the hope that their sacrifice could turn the tide of the war. As the torpedo squadrons approached the Japanese fleet, the skies erupted with violence. Flak, bursts of explosive shells designed to shred aircraft, exploded around them in terrifying clouds of smoke and shrapnel. Japanese Zero fighters dove in, slicing through the air with ruthless precision. The Devastators, burdened by heavy torpedoes and slow speed, were easy prey. One by one, planes were torn apart. Flames erupted, wings were shredded, and engines exploded in fiery bursts. The ocean below caught the wreckage of doomed aircrews as they plunged toward the sea. The air was thick with the smell of burning fuel and the roar of machine guns. But still, the torpedo bombers pressed forward, undeterred by the carnage unfolding around them. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the USS Hornet, was a figure of unyielding bravery. Waldron had rallied his men into a tight formation and pressed the attack with relentless courage. Despite being under constant fire, he refused to break formation or retreat. His squadron was almost entirely wiped out, but their attack forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver sharply to avoid the torpedoes. This movement disrupted their fighter screen, the wall of protective fighters circling the fleet, leaving openings that would soon be exploited by the next wave of American attackers. The losses among the torpedo squadrons were devastating. Nearly all of the 40 planes that had taken off were destroyed or forced to turn back. Few pilots survived the hellish encounter. Those who did were haunted by the sight of their comrades falling, consumed by fire or lost in the endless ocean. But in their sacrifice lay a vital spark. Their attack broke the rhythm of the Japanese defense, and for the first time in the battle, the enemy appeared vulnerable. Back on the decks of the American carriers, the mood was somber. Crews mourned their fallen friends even as they prepared for the next wave of attacks. Letters sent home after the battle would tell tales of young men who faced death with steady eyes and quiet resolve, who knew they might never see their families again, but flew anyway. The price they paid was immense, but so was the courage they showed. The Japanese fleet, confident in their skill and superior machines, was stunned by the ferocity of the torpedo attacks. Their pilots scrambled to respond, but the disruption in their formations created dangerous gaps. The tight coordination of the Japanese air defense was broken. Their carriers, the core of their offensive power, were suddenly exposed. Into this chaos, the American dive bombers moved. Fast, agile, and deadly, these planes were poised to strike with precision. But their success depended entirely on the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons. Without the distraction and disruption caused by those brave crews, the dive bombers would never have found the weak points in the enemy's defenses. The torpedo squadron's sacrifice would become one of the most poignant and heroic moments of the Battle of Midway. Though they failed to score hits themselves, their courage bought time and created openings that changed the course of the battle. Their story is one of grim determination in the face of overwhelming odds, a testament to the cost of victory and the valor of those who give everything for their country. As the sun rose higher and the battle raged on, the memory of those torpedo pilots hung in the air like a solemn vow, a promise that their sacrifice would not be forgotten and that it would pave the way for victory. Chapter 14. The Turning Point. Dive bombers arrive. June 4, 1942. The vast Pacific Ocean was cloaked in thick, acrid smoke. The sun hung low, its rays barely piercing through the haze of war. The skies, once eerily calm before the storm, were now torn asunder by the roaring engines of American dive bombers. This was the moment that would change everything, a moment forged in sacrifice, courage, and razor-sharp timing. For hours, the battle had raged. The brave torpedo squadrons had flown headlong into a deadly hail of enemy fire, their sacrifice staggering but necessary. Their attacks had broken the Japanese defensive formations, forcing the enemy carriers to maneuver desperately and splinter their fighter screens. Though the torpedo bombers had been almost entirely wiped out, their unyielding courage bought a critical opening. Now, soaring through the smoke-choked sky came the SBD dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, planes designed for speed, precision, and deadly power. These pilots carried the hopes of a nation, each knowing that success or failure here could shape the entire course of the Pacific War. As the dive bombers approached, The Japanese fleet appeared as a sprawling fortress of steel and fire. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were caught in a chaotic scramble. On their decks, sailors and aircrews rushed to refuel and rearm planes, unaware that the American attackers were closing in faster than anyone had expected. The scene below was like a simmering volcano on the brink of eruption. Fuel tanks were vulnerable, bombs sat ready to be loaded, and planes were tightly packed, all perfect tinder for disaster. The dive bombers reached their release points at incredible speed. In a breathtaking, synchronized ballet of destruction, they pulled steep, nearly vertical dives toward their targets. Suspended for a heartbeat between sky and sea, each pilot released their bombs with surgical precision. The payload screamed downward, slamming into flight decks, hangars, and fuel stores. Explosions roared, showers of burning debris cascaded into the ocean, and towering infernos burst into life. The carriers, once symbols of Japanese naval power, now became floating tombs of fire and chaos. On Akagi, a bomb tore through the hangar deck, igniting fuel and ammunition. Flames spread like wildfire, and the ship began to list, its crew fighting a losing battle to save their vessel. Nearby, Kaga suffered a similar fate. Multiple bomb hits tore through its decks, triggering catastrophic fires. The heat became unbearable. Men were trapped below decks, while others fought to contain the blaze. The carrier's structure groaned under the strain, decks buckling and twisting as explosions shattered bulkheads. Soryu, too, was engulfed. A direct hit from a well-placed bomb pierced its flight deck, sparking a chain reaction of explosions. The ship's once proud silhouette was quickly swallowed by smoke and flame. From the American carriers, sailors watched in stunned silence. Then, as the gravity of the moment settled, cheers erupted, a cathartic release of hope and triumph. The tide of the battle had shifted, and the Japanese fleet was reeling under the precise, devastating blows. Yet, amid the celebration, tension remained high. The fourth Japanese carrier, Hiru, was still operational and had launched counterattacks that had damaged the USS Yorktown. The battle was far from decided. In the air, the dive bomber pilots prepared to press their advantage. Many had witnessed their comrades fall in earlier attacks. Now, fueled by a fierce determination and the memory of sacrifice, they pushed on, ready to strike again and finish what the torpedo squadrons had started. Below, the men on the burning Japanese carriers faced horror beyond imagining. Fires raged unchecked. Explosions rocked the ships, sending shockwaves through the water. For many, it was a final desperate struggle to save what remained or abandon ship before the flames consumed them. The destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu within such a short span was unprecedented. These were the backbone of Japan's offensive might, and their loss would cripple the Imperial Navy's capacity to wage war in the Pacific. Back on the American side, victory came with its own cost. The USS Yorktown, though still afloat, was heavily damaged. Her crew fought heroically to keep her from sinking, patching holes and controlling flooding amid ongoing air raids. The battle for Midway was a brutal clash of wills, machines, and men. It was a contest not only of technology and strategy, but of heart and sacrifice. The arrival of the dive bombers, striking at the precise moment when the enemy was most vulnerable, proved to be the turning point. The sun climbed higher over the Pacific, illuminating the smoking wreckage of the once mighty Japanese carriers. The battle was far from over, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. The U.S. Navy had dealt a staggering blow, one that would echo through history. In those moments, the courage of countless men, from the torpedo squadrons who flew into near-certain death to the dive bomber pilots who seized their chance, had rewritten the fate of the Pacific War. Their sacrifice and valor would be remembered forever as the turning point where hope rose from the ashes of devastation. Chapter 15, Hiryu's Revenge. June 4, 1942. The battle that would come to define the Pacific War was a volatile storm raging across thousands of miles of open ocean. The Japanese fleet had already suffered devastating losses. 3 of their mighty carriers lay burning or sinking beneath the waves, victims of the unrelenting assault by American dive bombers. But amid the wreckage and smoke, the 4th carrier, Hiru, remained a fierce and dangerous threat. While the American fleet was still catching its breath from the shock and awe of the morning's strikes, Hiru's crew worked with grim determination. Their ship, though battered and scarred, was alive, still capable of launching aircraft, still a potent instrument of war. On her flight deck, pilots scrambled into their planes, engines roaring to life, ready to exact a brutal vengeance. From the hangar decks to the bridge, men moved with urgent purpose. There was no time to mourn the fallen or dwell on the destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Hiru had to fight to keep Japan's last chance alive, fight to turn the tide of battle that now seemed to be slipping away. The air crackled with tension as Nakajima B-5 and Kate, torpedo bombers, and Aichi D-3 Aval dive bombers prepared for takeoff. Their engines thundered, their pilots' faces set with steely resolve. They knew the stakes, the survival of their fleet, and perhaps the fate of their nation rested on this strike. Escorted by the swift and deadly Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, the strike group surged into the skies, slicing through the smoke and chaos above the ocean. Below, the American fleet braced, their radar and lookouts scanning for the next wave of attackers. The men on USS Yorktown, still reeling from earlier damage but resolute, scrambled to their battle stations. Despite fierce anti-aircraft fire, the Japanese attack wave pressed relentlessly forward. Their bombs and torpedoes found critical targets on Yorktown's starboard side, ripping through steel and igniting fuel stores. The ship lurched under the impact, fire and smoke billowing from multiple points. The roar of explosions, the shouts of men, the frantic scramble to control flooding and fires, all played out in a deadly ballet of chaos and courage. Sailors were thrown to the decks or overboard. Some fought bravely to save their shipmates, while others tended the wounded amid the roar of battle. The strike from Hiru was a harsh reminder that, though damaged, the Japanese fleet was not yet defeated. The carrier's pilots pressed their advantage, continuing to harass and attack, forcing the Americans into a fierce defensive posture. Yet even as Hiru's planes wreaked havoc, the Americans rallied. Fighter planes scrambled to intercept, guns blazed in the sky, and damage control teams below decks worked feverishly to patch the gaping wounds inflicted on Yorktown. The cost was immense on both sides. Hiru's pilots knew they were risking everything, diving into a storm of flak and machine gun fire. The Americans paid dearly as well, with men killed or wounded in the onslaught, and the mighty Yorktown limping under heavy damage. The clash between Hiru and the American fleet was not just a battle of ships and planes. It was a battle of wills, of spirit and tenacity. Every bomb dropped, every shell fired, was a desperate bid to tip the scales. But the tide was turning. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons and the timely arrival of the dive bombers had already shattered the Japanese attack. Hiru's counterstrike, while fierce and deadly, could not undo the devastating damage sustained by her sister carriers. Still, in those intense moments, Hiru's revenge was a grim testament to the brutal realities of war, where victory and loss were separated by the thinnest margins, and every act of courage came at an immense cost. As the smoke thickened and the sun dipped low, the fate of Hiru and the entire Japanese fleet hung in the balance. The next moves would determine not just the outcome of the Battle of Midway, but the future course of the Pacific War. Chapter 16, Death of Hiru. June 4, 1942. The Pacific sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the endless ocean in hues of orange and crimson, a stark contrast to the dark clouds of smoke and fire that now marked the battlefield. The mighty Imperial Japanese carrier Hiru, the last survivor of her once powerful strike force, still floated on the restless sea. But her fate was sealed. For hours, Hiru had been the relentless, vengeful spirit of the Japanese fleet. Her air crews had launched wave after wave of torpedo bombers and dive bombers, pounding the battered American fleet, especially the crippled USS Yorktown. The courage of those pilots, braving swarms of American fighters, fierce anti-aircraft fire, and the perils of the open sea, was unquestionable. They were fighting not just for a ship, but for the honor of their fleet and the survival of their nation. But now, as the evening deepened, the tide of battle was turning with terrifying finality. From the decks of the American carriers Enterprise and Yorktown, the pilots prepared for a counterstrike that would seal the fate of Hiru. Despite fatigue, the relentless pounding, and the ever-present danger, they climbed into their dive bombers once again. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, but their eyes burned with resolve. This mission was their last, their chance to end the nightmare and claim a victory that would echo through history. The sea below churned, a dark mirror reflecting the fiery chaos that engulfed the carriers and ships alike. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning fuel and metal. On board the American ships, men held their breath, eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale signs of the enemy's approach. Suddenly, like falcons diving from the sky, the American dive bombers appeared. Their engines screamed through the smoke-filled air as they made their final, deadly descent toward Hiru. The pilots clutched their controls with white-knuckled intensity, each second stretching into eternity. With pinpoint precision, the bombs were released, thundering into Hiryu's flight deck and hangar. Explosions rocked the carrier, sending shockwaves through her steel frame. Fire erupted instantly, fueled by the stored aviation gasoline and munitions packed tightly within her decks. Flames roared like a living beast, consuming everything in their path. Inside the ship, chaos and courage collided. The crew fought desperately to control the inferno, spraying water and foam in a losing battle against the furious blaze. Men screamed orders, fought fires, tended the wounded, and prepared for the inevitable. The heat was unbearable, the smoke thick and choking. The carrier groaned under the strain. Her decks buckled and cracked, twisted by the heat and explosions. The bright flames lit the faces of sailors etched with determination and fear, some praying silently, others readying to abandon ship. Hiryu's list grew steadily worse, her proud silhouette leaning toward the dark, hungry sea beneath. The ocean's cold embrace waited patiently, ready to reclaim what had once been a symbol of Japanese naval might. Then, in a final moment heavy with tragedy and valor, Hiryu slipped beneath the waves, dragged down by the weight of fire, destruction, and loss. Her disappearance marked the death knell for Japan's carrier fleet at Midway and the end of their hopes for control of the Pacific. Back on the American carriers, the atmosphere was thick with a mixture of relief and sorrow. The cost of victory had been staggering, lives lost, ships damaged, and the brutal reality of war laid bare. Yet, the destruction of Hiru marked a turning point in the Pacific War, a shift in power that would ripple through the coming years. The men who fought and died that day would be remembered as heroes, not just for their skill and bravery, but for their sacrifice in a battle that changed the course of history. As the night settled over the Pacific, the smoldering remains of the battle faded into darkness, but the legacy of Midway, and of Hiryu's final moments, would burn brightly in the hearts and minds of all who survived, and in the pages of history forever. Chapter 17. The Sinking of the Yorktown. June 5, 1942. The early morning light spilled softly over the restless Pacific Ocean, painting the waves with a fragile glow that belied the grim reality below the surface. The Battle of Midway, raging fiercely for days, had left scars on both fleets. Among the battered remnants of the U.S. Navy's striking force, the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown stood as a testament to grit and determination. Severely damaged in earlier attacks, she had undergone a miraculous, around-the-clock repair effort in just 72 hours, a feat of naval engineering and sheer willpower that allowed her to rejoin the battle. Yet fate had more trials in store. As dawn broke, the sea appeared calm, almost serene. But lurking beneath the tranquil surface, danger prowled unseen. The Japanese submarine I-168, a silent predator lurking in the depths, had stalked the damaged carrier. With deadly patience, it closed the distance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The I-168's mission was clear: to finish what the earlier air attacks had started and sink the Yorktown for good. On board Yorktown, the crew was worn, but their spirits remained steadfast. Men moved quickly, tending to the wounded, fighting lingering fires, shoring up bulkheads weakened by torpedoes and bombs. The smell of salt, smoke, and burned fuel hung heavy in the air. The ship, though wounded, was a symbol of resilience, a bulwark against the storm of war. Without warning, an eerie silence was shattered by the piercing sound of alarms blaring throughout the ship. The words, "Torpedo incoming," cut through the air like a knife. The crew sprang into action, trained for this very moment, though the terror in their eyes betrayed the enormity of the threat. Damage control teams rushed to their stations. Gunners scrambled to man their weapons. The bridge buzzed with urgent commands. The water beside the Yorktown suddenly erupted as the first torpedo slammed into the hull amidships. The explosion sent shockwaves throughout the ship, violently shaking her steel frame and throwing men off their feet. Bulkheads buckled under the immense pressure, and seawater surged into the lower compartments. Flames ignited from ruptured fuel lines, sending plumes of black smoke skyward. The once majestic carrier was now a battlefield unto itself. Yet, amid the chaos, the crew's resolve hardened. Like firefighters battling an overwhelming blaze, damage control parties poured water onto the fires, sealed flooded compartments, and fought to stabilize their ship. They knew that the Yorktown's survival depended on every second they could buy. But the I-168 was relentless. Minutes later, a second torpedo tore into the stern, crippling the carrier's engines and knocking out her steering capabilities. The ship began to list, her decks tilting ominously toward the dark waters below. The power that had once propelled Yorktown forward faltered, and the great vessel now seemed to struggle just to stay afloat. Men on deck clung to rails, their faces a mix of exhaustion, fear, and unyielding determination. The cries of the wounded echoed above the thunderous roar of engines and the hissing escape of steam from damaged pipes. The sea, once a source of strength and freedom, had transformed into a looming threat. As the situation worsened, the order was given: abandon ship. Lifeboats were lowered into the turbulent waters. Sailors helped one another over the rails, some hesitating as the weight of duty clashed with the instinct to survive. Bonds forged in battle held firm even in these darkest moments. The great Yorktown, which had defied death just days earlier, now succumbed to the relentless assault. Slowly, steadily, she slipped beneath the waves, the Pacific Ocean reclaiming her as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Her sinking was a somber punctuation mark in the fierce battle, a testament to the high cost of war. Though the loss of Yorktown was one of the few bright spots in the Japanese effort during Midway, it did little to diminish the overall turning of the tide in favor of the Allies. The courage of her crew, their tireless efforts to save their ship, and their ultimate sacrifice resonated deeply across the fleet. They were heroes, their names etched into the memory of a pivotal battle that would change the course of the Pacific War. As the smoke cleared and the waters calmed, the sun reflected off the ocean's surface, now forever marked by the sacrifices made beneath. The battle was far from over, but the sinking of the Yorktown was a poignant reminder of the stakes, where victory and loss were measured not just in ships and territory, but in human lives and unbreakable spirit. Chapter 18: The Toll of War. The sun dipped slowly beyond the horizon on June 7, 1942, casting long shadows over the vast Pacific Ocean. Beneath the tranquil waves lay the remnants of one of the most decisive and brutal naval battles in history, the Battle of Midway. What had begun as a clash of titanic naval powers, a desperate gamble by the Japanese Imperial Navy, had ended with profound loss and irreversible consequences. But these were not just statistics or abstract numbers. They were the stories of men, young and old, caught in the merciless tides of war, their lives extinguished or forever altered in the crucible of battle. For Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru had been torn from the waters, their hulks shattered by the relentless assault of American dive bombers. These floating fortresses, symbols of Japan's naval dominance and imperial ambition, were now smoldering wrecks sunk into the ocean's depths. With them went over 3,000 Japanese souls, pilots, sailors, mechanics, and officers, whose dreams, hopes, and futures were swallowed by fire, water, and steel. For Japan, the loss was more than tactical. It was a devastating strategic blow. These carriers had formed the backbone of their Pacific offensive, each a floating city of warplanes, men, and machines. The destruction of so much of their striking power meant the erosion of their ability to wage offensive operations for the foreseeable future. Experienced pilots and crews, many irreplaceable, were lost, a wound deeper than any sunk ship. On the American side, the cost was severe but comparatively less crippling. The United States lost the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown and a destroyer, smaller in scale but still significant in sacrifice. 307 American servicemen gave their lives in this battle. Each death was a poignant reminder of the fierce contest for the Pacific, where victory was measured not just in ships and territory, but in the human heartbeats lost beneath the ocean's surface. The aftermath of Midway was a mosaic of shattered steel and shattered souls. The once proud Japanese fleet that had launched the war in the Pacific just 6 months earlier at Pearl Harbor now found itself crippled and reeling. Their carefully orchestrated plan to lure the U.S. fleet into a deadly trap had instead turned into a catastrophic defeat. The battle began in the cold, dark hours before dawn on June 4th. Japanese aircraft roared over Midway Atoll, dropping bombs that shook the island's foundations. Defenders on Midway, armed with outdated aircraft and limited resources, rose to meet the attack with a desperate and courageous defense. Anti-aircraft guns roared like thunder, sending streaks of tracer bullets skyward as pilots scrambled into their cockpits. Meanwhile, American torpedo squadrons launched from their carriers. The Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown soared into the sky on near-suicidal missions. Flying low and slow, without the protective shield of fighter cover, these brave men faced a deadly gauntlet of Japanese anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. Nearly all of the torpedo bombers were shot down, and hundreds of lives were lost in minutes. Yet, their sacrifice was not in vain. By drawing Japanese fighters down, they cleared the way for the arriving dive bombers. At the perfect moment, the dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown struck. In a matter of minutes, bombs found their marks on Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, turning decks into infernos, rupturing fuel tanks, and triggering chain reactions of explosions that doomed the carriers. The fiery destruction was a spectacle of chaos and devastation, a turning point that shattered Japanese hopes. Hiru, the fourth carrier, launched a desperate counterattack. Her aircraft hit the Yorktown with deadly accuracy, inflicting serious damage and killing many. The carrier that had once seemed invincible, rebuilt against all odds in 72 hours, was crippled again. But the Americans' resolve was unbroken. Dive bombers returned in the evening, setting Hiru ablaze and sealing her fate. The sinking of Yorktown on June 5th was a poignant moment. Despite heroic damage control and the tireless work of her crew, the carrier succumbed to a Japanese submarine torpedo attack. The ship that symbolized American tenacity now rested beneath the waves, joining the long list of sacrifices. The toll of the battle was not only measured in ships sunk or planes destroyed, but in the lives forever changed. Families received telegrams, letters from commanders informing them of their loved ones' fates. Mothers, wives, and children faced the heart-wrenching void left by husbands, fathers, and sons who would never return. The pain echoed from the decks of sunken carriers to the quiet homes back in America and Japan. Yet, amid the sorrow, Midway was a pivotal victory. It marked the first major defeat of the Japanese Navy and shifted the momentum in the Pacific toward the Allies. The Japanese would never again regain the offensive dominance they had wielded so effectively. The battle's outcome was a testament to intelligence, courage, sacrifice, and the unpredictable fortunes of war. The ocean that now concealed the broken ships and fallen men was a silent witness. It absorbed the echoes of explosions, the cries of men, and the hopes dashed in a matter of days. But it also held the promise of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, the human spirit endures. As the world moved forward into an uncertain future, the lessons and losses of Midway resonated. The price paid was immense, but the victory paved the way for a relentless Allied advance across the Pacific, an advance built on the bravery of those who fought, the memory of those who fell, and the enduring resolve to secure freedom on the world's great oceans. Chapter 19: Japan's Irreplaceable Loss. In the aftermath of the Battle of Midway, amid the smoldering wreckage of 4 of Japan's greatest aircraft carriers, lay a far graver and more enduring loss: the death of Japan's elite naval aviators and aircrew. These were not simply numbers on a casualty list. They were the souls of a generation of warriors, skilled beyond measure, whose loss would echo through the rest of the Pacific War like a haunting silence. The battle had not just sunk ships. It had shattered the core of Japan's naval air power. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force was built on the backs of these men. Pilots trained with painstaking care, aircrew bonded by experience and trust, who understood the deadly dance of carrier warfare like few others in the world. These were the warriors who took to the skies with precision and daring, who could read the clouds and the enemy's moves as if it were second nature. But the cost of Midway was catastrophic. More than 200 of Japan's best pilots and aircrew were lost. Men who had spent years mastering the complex skills of carrier takeoffs and landings, aerial combat maneuvers, and bombing tactics. They were the veterans of countless battles, the backbone of Japan's early successes in the Pacific. Their loss was not something that could be mended by merely sending fresh recruits to flight school. Japan's pilot training program was long and rigorous, often taking years to turn raw recruits into effective carrier aviators. It was a process that demanded not only technical skill, but also experience born from actual combat. The survivors of Midway understood this tragedy deeply, the bitter knowledge that the pool of seasoned aviators was rapidly drying up. Unlike Japan, the United States had invested heavily in a broader and more sustainable pilot training system. The American industrial and training machine could churn out new pilots more rapidly, replacing losses with fresh young men ready to take their place. The U.S. Navy's ability to replenish experienced aircrew was a strategic advantage that Japan could not match. In Japan, the loss of these elite airmen was like severing a limb from a great warrior, weakening, painful, and impossible to ignore. The remaining pilots had to carry heavier burdens, flying more missions with less rest, knowing that their comrades would never return. The impact was both tactical and psychological. For the commanders aboard the surviving Japanese ships and in their distant headquarters, the loss posed a dire dilemma. How to rebuild a force that was so finely tuned, so dependent on experience. How to train new pilots quickly enough to match the pace of the war, without sacrificing the quality of skill and cohesion. The answer was painfully clear: they could not. The human cost of Midway went beyond ships and planes. It cut to the very heart of Japan's naval aviation. The pilot who flew that last mission over Midway, the gunner who never returned to his carrier, the mechanic who maintained the planes now lost at sea. These men were irreplaceable in ways that went beyond their rank or role. Each pilot was a story, a son, a husband, a friend, who had trained for years, endured grueling physical and mental trials, and faced the deadly chaos of war with courage. Their deaths left gaps in the fabric of their squadrons that no new recruit could instantly fill. The comrades left behind felt their absence deeply, a silence amid the roar of warplanes and the thunder of guns. The loss also had strategic consequences. Without enough experienced aviators, Japan's ability to conduct complex carrier operations diminished. Carrier warfare was a precise ballet of timing, coordination, and skill. One misstep could lead to disaster. Less experienced pilots meant greater risks, less effective strikes, and ultimately, diminished combat effectiveness. For the Japanese Navy's leadership, this was a bitter pill. The Battle of Midway had been conceived as a grand plan to deliver a crippling blow to the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Instead, it had shattered their own naval air power, leaving them with fewer seasoned pilots and fewer operational carriers. In the quiet moments after the battle, as the Japanese command reckoned with their losses, the harsh truth settled in. The war in the Pacific had turned. The balance of power was shifting. America's industrial might, combined with its ability to train and deploy pilots at scale, gave it an advantage that Japan could not simply buy or build overnight. While Japanese propaganda tried to mask the defeat and rally the nation's spirit, the reality on the decks of surviving carriers was grim. Training programs were rushed, experience was sacrificed for numbers, and pilots were sent into combat with less preparation. The once feared Japanese naval aviators were no longer the unstoppable force they had been in the early months of the war. Meanwhile, the United States Navy celebrated Midway as a turning point, a battle won not just by ships and planes, but by intelligence, bravery, and resilience. But even the Americans understood the heavy toll. The men who had flown into battle that day, many of them young and green, had fought with a courage forged in fire and loss. Their sacrifice ensured that the tide was turning, but the cost was forever etched into their souls. As the war dragged on, the effects of Japan's irreplaceable loss became more evident. Battles that once favored the Japanese carrier air groups now tilted towards the Americans. New pilots, no matter how brave, could not fully replace the knowledge and instinct honed by years in the sky. The devastating lessons of Midway shaped the Pacific War in ways no one could have foreseen. The ocean depths off Midway now hold not only the wreckage of great ships, but the memory of the fallen aviators, men whose skill and sacrifice marked a turning point in history. Their legacy is a reminder of the true cost of war, not just machines lost, but lives changed and ended, and the fragile human thread that ties nations to their fate. Chapter 20. The Shift in the Pacific. The sun had barely risen over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean when the reality of what had happened at Midway began to settle in, a reality that would change the course of the war and alter the fate of nations. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once seeming unstoppable, had suffered a defeat so severe that the very fabric of their power was torn apart. The battle was over, but its consequences rippled outward like shockwaves across the ocean, signaling the end of Japan's strategic initiative. From this moment forward, the balance of power in the Pacific tilted decisively toward the United States. The battle had been fought with ferocity, courage, and heartbreak. For mighty Japanese carriers, vessels that had been the heart of Japan's naval strength, lay broken and sunk beneath the waves. Thousands of experienced men, the finest aviators and sailors Japan had to offer, were lost in the flames and depths. The American victory, though costly, was a turning point, a moment when the tide of war shifted irrevocably. For Japan, Midway was not merely a lost battle, it was the shattering of a dream. The strategic initiative, the power to dictate where, when, and how battles would be fought in the Pacific, was now lost. Japan could no longer project its dominance with the same confidence. The bold, rapid advances that had carried the Imperial Navy from Pearl Harbor to the shores of Southeast Asia would give way to a defensive posture, a desperate attempt to hold what had been gained. On the other side, the United States, buoyed by the victory at Midway, seized the moment. The war in the Pacific transformed from one of reactive defense into aggressive offense. The U.S. Navy, energized by the triumph, pushed forward with relentless determination, launching a series of island-hopping campaigns that would bring American forces ever closer to Japan's home islands. But this shift was not merely about ships and troops moving across the ocean. It was a profound change in momentum, morale, and strategic thinking. The Pacific War, which had seemed a dark and uncertain struggle after Pearl Harbor, now carried a spark of hope and purpose. It was a war that would be fought with new vigor, as the United States marshaled its vast industrial might, its growing fleet, and its expanding army to turn the tide. The Japanese leadership faced a grim reality. The loss of 4 carriers meant fewer planes to launch strikes, fewer pilots with the skill and experience needed to dominate the skies. The once vaunted divine wind of Japan's naval aviation was diminished, and rebuilding that force was a task fraught with impossible odds. The industrial and training apparatus simply could not replace the lost expertise fast enough. Each subsequent battle would be harder, the gap between the two navies widening. Meanwhile, American industrial output surged. New carriers rolled off the shipyards, trained pilots flooded flight schools, and innovations in technology and tactics accelerated. The U.S. Navy learned from each encounter, improving coordination between ships, planes, and ground forces. The lessons of Midway, costly as they were, became stepping stones toward victory. The psychological impact of this shift was immense. For American sailors and airmen, Midway was a validation of their training, intelligence efforts, and courage. It proved that despite being caught off guard at Pearl Harbor, the United States could strike back decisively and win. The victory lifted morale not only in the military but across the nation, fueling a determination that would carry through years of hard-fought battles. For Japan, the loss was a blow to national pride and military confidence. The carefully crafted image of invincibility was shattered. The question loomed larger than ever. How to recover from such a defeat, and what could be done to regain the initiative that had been lost? The island-hopping campaign that followed was a direct outgrowth of the shift at Midway. Instead of attempting to hold a sprawling empire, the United States focused on capturing strategic islands, establishing airfields and naval bases that would serve as stepping stones toward Japan itself. Each victory chipped away at Japan's perimeter, forcing it to stretch its resources thin and defend multiple fronts. Amidst this vast and complex war, the men who fought on the decks of carriers, in the cockpits of fighter planes, and in the jungles of distant islands carried the burden of history on their shoulders. They knew that Midway was a pivot point, a battle that would define the war and their lives. The sacrifices made there were not forgotten. They became a source of inspiration and a reminder of the cost of victory. Yet, the shift in the Pacific was not instantaneous. Japan still possessed formidable forces and launched fierce counterattacks. Battles such as Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf would test the resolve and strategy of both sides. But the momentum had undeniably changed. The initiative belonged to the United States, and it wielded that power with increasing confidence. Midway was more than a battle. It was a statement, a declaration that the tide had turned. It marked the beginning of a relentless push by the Allies that would eventually bring freedom to the Pacific and end the war. But the path ahead was long, hard, and marked by sacrifice. The ocean that had once been a vast stage for Japan's dominance now belonged to a rising power. The sun would set on the Japanese Empire's expansion and rise on America's march to victory. The shift in the Pacific was not just a military reality. It was a seismic change in the destiny of nations, shaped by courage, intelligence, and the unyielding will to prevail. As we look back on the Battle of Midway, we see the moment when the balance of power changed, when the seeds of victory were sown, and when the Pacific War entered a new and decisive phase. The story is one of loss and triumph, of human bravery and strategic genius, and above all, a testament to the resilience of those who fought to shape the future of the world. Chapter 21, Chester Nimitz, Calm in Chaos. The war was swirling like a violent storm across the Pacific, a storm of uncertainty, fear, and staggering losses. Fleets clashed, planes roared overhead, and lives hung in the balance. Yet, amid this chaos, a single figure stood like a lighthouse in the dark, guiding the course of the conflict with steady hands and a sharp mind. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, embodied calm in chaos. His leadership and decisions shaped the very outcome of the Battle of Midway and, ultimately, the course of the entire Pacific War. Imagine the weight on Nimitz's shoulders. Just 6 months earlier, the United States had been reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor, a devastating blow that shattered fleets and morale alike. The Pacific seemed vast and perilous, an ocean of threats and unknowns. The Japanese fleet loomed large, aggressive, and seemingly unstoppable. The pressure was immense. How do you lead a fleet that must confront this overwhelming force? How do you plan when the enemy's moves are shrouded in secrecy and deception? How do you keep hope alive when the stakes are nothing less than survival? Nimitz was not a man given to rash decisions or showy gestures. His leadership style was quiet, composed, rooted in careful thought and a deep understanding of naval warfare. He was a man who believed in preparation, intelligence, and trust in his people. But beneath that calm exterior was a fierce determination to protect his country and turn the tide of war. As news of Japanese plans began to emerge, thanks to the brilliant codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii, Nimitz faced a monumental choice. Should he believe the intelligence? Should he risk sending his carriers into what could be a trap? For an admiral, sending his fleet into harm's way without certainty was akin to walking a tightrope over a raging sea. But Nimitz trusted his cryptographers, his officers, and his own instincts. He gambled on Midway. This decision was the fulcrum upon which the battle would turn. Nimitz's headquarters was a hive of activity in those tense days. Maps, charts, and reports were spread across tables as officers and analysts worked furiously to piece together the Japanese intentions. Nimitz himself was often found quietly consulting with his trusted aides, weighing risks and possibilities. He understood that victory in the Pacific would depend not just on firepower, but on strategy, foresight, and the willingness to take calculated risks. His calm demeanor radiated confidence to those under his command. In a war filled with uncertainty, Nimitz was a rock. Sailors and pilots alike drew strength from his leadership, knowing their admiral had a plan, even if that plan carried enormous risk. Nimitz's strategy was not just about confronting the enemy. It was about understanding the broader picture. Midway Atoll was a tiny speck in the vast Pacific, but Nimitz recognized its significance as a strategic point, an outpost that could either protect Hawaii and the West Coast or fall into Japanese hands and threaten the entire American defensive line. When Japanese carriers set out on their mission to capture Midway, Nimitz positioned his forces cleverly. He divided his limited carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, to cover multiple angles, anticipating Japanese moves with remarkable precision. His plan was to lie in wait, to strike decisively when the opportunity arose. But Nimitz was more than a strategist. He was also a master of delegation and trust. He empowered his commanders, men like Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher, to execute the plan with flexibility and courage. He knew that battle was chaotic and unpredictable, and no plan survived first contact with the enemy. By entrusting capable leaders with the freedom to adapt, Nimitz created a command structure resilient enough to face the storm. The pressure was relentless. Every message, every report could mean the difference between victory and disaster. The Admiral's nights were long, filled with difficult decisions, weighing lives against objectives. Yet, he remained composed. His calm was not ignorance of the stakes, but a mastery of the burden. He knew that panic or rashness would doom his forces. As the battle unfolded, Nimitz's trust in intelligence and in his commanders was vindicated. The American carriers caught the Japanese off guard, striking with devastating effect. His gamble paid off, turning the tide of the Pacific War. But Nimitz's leadership was not just about tactics or strategy. It was about people, about the men whose lives depended on his decisions. He understood the human cost of war. He knew that behind every ship's name was a crew, a family, a story. He carried their hopes and fears with him. One of Nimitz's most poignant qualities was his humility. Despite his pivotal role, he shunned personal glory. He credited the success of Midway to the bravery of his sailors and airmen, to the brilliance of the codebreakers, and to the sacrifices made on both sides. In speeches and correspondence, he spoke of duty, honor, and the shared struggle of a nation. Nimitz's leadership in the Battle of Midway set a standard for command in wartime, a blend of intellect, courage, empathy, and calm that inspired those around him to achieve the impossible. His decisions, made in rooms far from the front lines, rippled outward to shape history. Yet, the story does not end with Midway's victory. Nimitz knew the war was far from over. He prepared for the next battles, the next challenges, understanding that calm in chaos was a continuous demand. The battle had shown the power of intelligence, planning, and leadership, but it also underscored the unpredictability and horror of war. In the quiet moments after the guns fell silent, Nimitz reflected on the price paid and the road ahead. The calm in chaos was his gift to a nation at war, a beacon guiding the fleet through dark waters toward a hard-fought peace. As the Pacific theater shifted under his steady hand, Admiral Chester Nimitz became more than a military leader. He became a symbol of resilience, wisdom, and the enduring spirit of those who fight not for conquest, but for survival and freedom. Chapter 22. Isuroku Yamamoto, the Wounded Genius. The sky over the vast Pacific was a canvas of blue that day, calm and endless. But beneath that serene expanse, a storm was brewing. A storm of ambition, strategy, and fatal miscalculations. Admiral Isuroku Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's naval strategy, stood at the center of this tempest. His mind, brilliant and innovative, had brought Japan to the edge of imperial dominance in the Pacific. But on that fateful day at Midway, the genius of his plan would unravel, revealing the fatal flaw buried deep within his grand design. The wounds from this battle would not only mark the Japanese Navy, but would shadow Yamamoto himself until his own death in 1943. Yamamoto was not just any admiral. He was a man of vision, intellect, and contradiction. Born into a world of samurai tradition, yet educated in the modern ways of naval warfare, he was a bridge between eras. He understood the power of air and sea like few others of his time, having studied at Harvard and traveled widely. He foresaw that any future war with the United States would be brutal and long, and he knew that Japan's chances hinged on crippling America's Pacific Fleet before it could fully mobilize. It was this insight that led to his boldest and ultimately most catastrophic operation, the plan to lure the American fleet into a trap near the tiny island of Midway. It was a plan born of brilliance, but burdened by complexity. To understand Yamamoto's thinking is to understand the high stakes and immense pressures he faced. Imagine Yamamoto in his war room, surrounded by charts, reports, and maps strewn across the table. His face, a mask of calm concentration, hides a storm of calculations and hopes. His plan was audacious: to execute a multi-pronged attack that would simultaneously strike Midway, seize it as a strategic base, and draw the American carriers into battle where they could be destroyed. The Japanese fleet would strike like a coiled serpent, precise, overwhelming, and final. But here lay the fatal flaw. Yamamoto's plan depended on perfect timing and coordination across a vast ocean. It required his fleet to split into multiple task forces, each moving on different courses, communicating under the threat of enemy detection, all while relying on surprise and speed. The complexity was immense, like conducting a symphony where each section played different pieces in different keys, hoping the music would somehow harmonize at the climax. The reality of naval warfare, however, is chaos. Unpredictable, unforgiving chaos. Communication was limited, weather conditions fickle, and human error inevitable. In the vast Pacific, with its endless horizons and unseen dangers, coordinating such a plan was akin to juggling knives on a tightrope. And then, there was the enemy's secret weapon, the codebreakers at Station Hypo. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, his carefully concealed plans were being deciphered and decoded by brilliant American cryptographers led by Joseph Rockefford. They had uncovered the true target of the Japanese operation, Midway, codenamed AF, and relayed this intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. This gave the Americans the crucial advantage of foreknowledge, allowing them to prepare an ambush of their own. Yamamoto's grand design began to falter even before the first shot was fired. As the Japanese fleet moved towards Midway, the coordination problems surfaced quickly. His forces, scattered and spread thin, struggled to maintain communication and synchronize their attacks. Meanwhile, the American carriers lay in wait, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Yamamoto's plan, brilliant on paper, was collapsing in the reality of war. The losses at Midway were staggering for Japan. 4 of their 6 carriers were sunk, along with hundreds of experienced pilots and crew. The scale of destruction was so severe that it irreparably weakened the Japanese Navy's offensive capabilities. And at the heart of this catastrophe was the wounded genius, Admiral Yamamoto. His vision shattered, his strategy defeated. Yet, even in defeat, Yamamoto's character shines through history. He was a man deeply committed to his country, yet also aware of the enormous risks he had taken. He had warned Tokyo that war with the United States would be long and costly, that Japan lacked the industrial capacity to sustain such a conflict indefinitely. His warnings went unheeded by the military establishment and government officials eager for quick victories. After Midway, Yamamoto continued to command Japanese naval operations, but the shadow of that battle hung over him. The loss at Midway was not just a strategic defeat, it was a personal wound. Some accounts suggest that Yamamoto felt the weight of responsibility deeply, haunted by the cost in lives and the failure of his plan. Yamamoto's story takes a final, tragic turn in April 1943. In a covert American operation known as Operation Vengeance, U.S. forces intercepted and ambushed Yamamoto's plane over the Solomon Islands. The admiral was killed instantly, a casualty of the very intelligence warfare he had helped to inspire. His death was a symbolic blow, the loss of Japan's greatest naval mind. But even in death, Yamamoto's legacy is complex. He was a visionary who reshaped naval warfare, an admiral who understood the dawn of air power and aircraft carriers. Yet, he was also a man whose greatest plan, Midway, was undone by its own complexity and the unyielding realities of war. The story of Isuroku Yamamoto is a reminder of the thin line between genius and hubris, between brilliance and failure. It is a story of ambition and tragedy, of a leader who dared to gamble everything on a single move and paid the ultimate price. As the Pacific War raged on, the wounds of Midway would define the fate of Japan's navy, and the memory of Yamamoto would linger as both a symbol of strategic brilliance and the cruel costs of war. Chapter 23: Rockefford and the Codebreakers. The tension in the cramped room was palpable. A single slip, a wrong guess, could cost thousands of lives. Ships, planes, sailors, entire fleets lost to the invisible war of secrets and deception. But amid the quiet clatter of typewriters and the low murmur of hushed voices, a small group of men fought a battle unlike any other, a battle of minds against a deadly enemy code. At the heart of this struggle was Joseph Rockefford, a naval officer with a knack for puzzles and a fierce dedication to his country. His team's success in cracking Japan's secret messages would change the course of the Pacific War, and yet, for years afterward, their triumph would remain largely unknown, overshadowed by the roar of cannon and the blaze of fire. It began with a mystery. The Japanese Navy communicated through coded messages, using a complex cipher system known as JN-25. These were not simple letters or numbers. This was a tangled web of symbols, obscured by layers of random keys and shifting patterns. To break the code was to glimpse the enemy's plans, to see the unseen, to pierce the veil of war's chaos. Imagine trying to solve a puzzle that changes every day, where every clue is buried beneath false trails and deliberate misdirection. This was the world Rockefford and his team entered. Working long hours, often late into the night, they combed through intercepted radio transmissions, looking for patterns and irregularities, piecing together fragments of information like a shattered mirror. The stakes were enormous. If the Americans could decode just enough of the Japanese messages, they might predict where the next attack would come. They might save lives, fleets, entire nations. But the pressure was intense. Time was short, and failure meant disaster. Rockefford was an unconventional leader, known for his sharp mind but also for his rebellious streak. He challenged assumptions and pushed back against bureaucratic skepticism. In the often rigid and hierarchical world of military intelligence, his willingness to think differently was both a strength and a source of friction. One of the most critical breakthroughs came when Rockefford's team focused on a mysterious code word, AF. Japanese messages hinted that AF was the target of a major fleet operation, but no one could say with certainty what it meant. Some feared it might be Midway, a small island with a strategic airbase, but the proof was elusive. To confirm their suspicions, Rockefford devised a clever ruse. He ordered Midway's radio operators to send an unencrypted message that their water purification system had broken down. Shortly afterward, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese transmission reporting that AF was short of water. This clever test confirmed beyond doubt that AF referred to Midway. This moment was a turning point. With the target identified, Admiral Nimitz could prepare his forces for an ambush, setting the stage for one of the most decisive naval battles in history. But while Rockefford and his team's work was crucial, it remained hidden behind layers of secrecy. Despite their success, Rockefford and his colleagues were not celebrated heroes. The intelligence community was secretive, and much of their work remained classified for decades. Worse, internal rivalries and bureaucratic politics sometimes sidelined Rockefford, who faced suspicion and criticism from higher-ups. His maverick style clashed with more traditional naval officers, and he was even removed from his command shortly after Midway. Yet, the impact of Rockefford's code-breaking was undeniable. By unraveling Japan's secrets, he gave the U.S. Navy the priceless gift of foresight, allowing them to anticipate attacks, conserve resources, and strike back with deadly precision. The human element of this story is striking. The codebreakers were not glamorous warriors on the front lines. They were quiet, often overlooked figures, working in dim rooms filled with the hum of radios and the scratch of pencils, bearing the burden of an invisible war. Many were young, brilliant, and underpaid, driven not by glory but by a fierce commitment to their country and to each other. Their story is one of perseverance, intellect, and courage. The courage to challenge authority, to believe in unseen patterns, and to carry the weight of lives resting on every decoded word. As the Battle of Midway unfolded, Rockefford's intelligence proved indispensable. American commanders relied on the decoded messages to position their ships and aircraft perfectly, to launch strikes at precisely the right moment. The ambush that followed was a stunning success, turning the tide of the war in the Pacific. But the story of the codebreakers does not end there. After the war, many of them faded into obscurity, their contributions overshadowed by the dramatic battles at sea and in the air. Recognition was slow, and the secrecy surrounding intelligence work meant their vital role was only acknowledged years later, as historians pieced together the hidden layers of the conflict. The tale of Joseph Rockefford and his team is a powerful reminder that wars are won not only by guns and bombs, but also by minds and courage behind the scenes. Their quiet victories shaped history, changing the fate of nations and redefining the art of warfare. As we reflect on Midway, we must remember the men in those shadowy rooms, decoding, analyzing, and fighting a secret battle that saved countless lives and changed the course of the Pacific War forever. Chapter 24. The Men Who Flew into Hell. A sudden roar split the early morning air, a squadron of tiny planes, their engines screaming like the very cries of fate. They surged upward, leaving behind the fragile safety of their carriers, into a sky thick with smoke, fire, and death. These were no ordinary flights. These were missions born in desperation, courage, and a fierce will to fight against overwhelming odds. The men in those cockpits knew, some whispered it aloud, that many would never see the sun set again. They were flying into hell. The Battle of Midway was a crucible that forged heroes from ordinary men. In cramped cockpits, exposed to the fury of anti-aircraft fire and the deadly speed of enemy fighters, U.S. pilots faced a terrifying choice every time they took off. Fight with every ounce of strength or fall silent in the ocean's cold embrace. Picture this. A torpedo bomber, slow and cumbersome, lumbering toward a fleet of sleek, armored warships bristling with guns. It's like sending a sparrow to challenge a hawk. There was no fighter escort to shield them, no safety net, just the roar of the engines, the jolt of the launch, and the terrifying knowledge that the sky itself was an enemy. These men, pilots, bombardiers, navigators, were more than just soldiers. They were ordinary Americans, young and full of hope, thrown into an extraordinary moment. Their faces, etched with determination and fear, told stories of quiet heroism. Faces like Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, who floated alone amidst the wreckage, watching his comrades vanish one by one. Or Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, who led his squadron with unshakable resolve into almost certain death. The planes they flew were machines of fragile metal and fragile hope. The Douglas TBD Devastators, often outdated and outmatched, lumbered toward the enemy like knights charging with wooden swords against steel. Their torpedoes, essentially underwater missiles, were the best hope to pierce the thick armor of Japanese carriers, but their slow speed and the danger of exposure made each attack a suicide mission. The pilots knew the odds. They knew the danger. Yet, they soared anyway. On June 4th, as the sun began to rise over the Pacific, waves of torpedo bombers launched from the USS Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet. They flew low, skimming over the ocean's surface, toward the Japanese fleet. The enemy's anti-aircraft guns opened up like thunderclaps, peppering the sky with flak, exploding shells designed to shred planes midair. The screech of bullets, the sharp stings of shrapnel, the roar of engines pushed to the edge, all became the soundtrack of their final journey. Many never reached their targets. Many were shot down before they could even release their torpedoes. Others crashed into the sea or vanished without a trace. But their sacrifice was not in vain. Their attacks forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver wildly, disrupting their flight decks and diverting fighter planes. This chaos created the fleeting window that American dive bombers needed to strike, and strike they did. In the aftermath, the sea was littered with wreckage and bodies, planes twisted like paper, men struggling in the water, clutching to life rafts or flotsam. Rescue crews risked everything to pull survivors from the depths, but many were lost to the unforgiving ocean. The human stories here are staggering in their depth. Men like Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, who led the dive bombers with razor-sharp precision, guided by sheer instinct and the desperate desire to avenge his fallen comrades. Or pilots like Lieutenant Richard Best, whose calm focus amidst chaos allowed him to deliver devastating blows to enemy ships. Their acts of valor were tinged with heartbreak. Every victory was paid for with loss. Brothers in arms who would never return home, whose dreams were cut short in the swirl of smoke and fire. Imagine the families waiting back in America, receiving telegrams that spoke in cold, clipped words, missing in action, killed in service. The faces behind those words were real people, with hopes and fears, sons and husbands whose names echoed across the ocean. Yet, despite the overwhelming danger, these men flew on. They carried the weight of a nation's hope on their shoulders, their courage shining like beacons in the darkest skies. The pilot's courage was not born from a reckless desire for glory, but from a deep sense of duty and love for their country. They understood that the battle for Midway was more than just a fight for an island. It was a fight for the future, for freedom, for the chance that their loved ones might live in a world free from tyranny. As the torpedo squadron soared into the storm of enemy fire, their stories became legends, not just of war, but of the human spirit's capacity to confront fear, sacrifice, and the unknown. Their sacrifice paved the way for victory, their bravery echoing through history. Yet, for years, many of these heroes remained unnamed, their deeds overshadowed by the larger narrative of the battle. This chapter of Midway is a testament to their courage, a reminder that behind every statistic, behind every ship sunk or saved, were men who faced hell and dared to fly. As the sun climbed higher on that fateful June day, these pilots became the heart of a turning tide, their sacrifice lighting the path toward a hard-won victory and a new chapter in the Pacific War. But the story does not end here. The skies above Midway would soon witness even fiercer battles, more daring missions and tragic losses, each moment shaping the course of history, one flight at a time. Chapter 25: Midway and the Carrier Era. The ocean trembled with the echoes of explosions, steel giants burning and sinking beneath the waves. The sky, once clear and blue, now hung heavy with smoke, fire, and the ghosts of a brutal battle. For mighty Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru had been reduced to smoldering hulks, their decks shattered, their crews lost to the sea. It was a defeat so profound, so total, that it changed the very course of naval warfare forever. This was Midway, the moment when the era of the battleship came to an abrupt, fiery end, and the aircraft carrier took its rightful place as the queen of the seas. For centuries, naval power had been measured by the might of battleships, massive, heavily armored ships bristling with giant guns, capable of firing explosive shells miles across the horizon. These steel behemoths were the symbols of national pride and military strength, the ultimate war machines. But at Midway, the battleship was revealed as a relic, outmatched and outmaneuvered by a new force, the aircraft carrier, a floating airbase that could strike far beyond the reach of any gun. The battle was not just about ships and planes. It was a clash of naval philosophies, a test of whether speed, surprise, and the reach of the sky could overcome the brute strength of armor and firepower. And in this test, the carriers emerged victorious. Imagine a chessboard spread across the vast Pacific Ocean, with fleets maneuvering like pieces, each waiting for the perfect move. The Japanese fleet, confident and aggressive, believed their mighty battleships and carriers could crush the American defenders. But the Americans, led by visionaries like Admiral Chester Nimitz, had wagered everything on the carrier's unique power, the ability to launch air strikes hundreds of miles away, unseen and untouchable until the bombs fell. This shift was more than technical. It was a revolution in naval strategy. The carriers were not just ships. They were launch pads for aerial warriors, planes that could scout, attack, and defend across the endless blue. They changed how wars were fought at sea, turning battles into skyward duels of speed, precision, and nerve. The pilots who took off from those decks, young men like Wade McCluskey, Max Leslie, and George Gay, became the new frontline soldiers, their courage and skill transforming the carrier from a mere ship into a weapon of unmatched power. At Midway, the carriers demonstrated their lethal potential. The Japanese carriers, caught off guard by American dive bombers, were vulnerable. They had to stop launching planes, slow down, and attempt to fight back. Their decks became blazing infernos. Meanwhile, American carriers, though fewer in number, had positioned themselves wisely, their planes ready to strike at the critical moment. The destruction of the 4 Japanese carriers marked the first time in history that so many carriers were lost in a single battle, a staggering blow that Japan never fully recovered from. On the American side, the loss of the USS Yorktown was deeply felt. It was a harsh reminder that the carrier era was still in its infancy, still learning hard lessons in vulnerability and endurance. But Yorktown's sacrifice underscored the immense risks and stakes involved in carrier warfare. Midway proved that battleships could no longer command the seas alone. They were slow, with limited range, and vulnerable to air attacks. Carriers, with their mobility and reach, redefined naval dominance. From that point forward, naval battles would be won or lost in the skies above, not on the decks below. The shift was also cultural. Naval officers had to rethink everything, from tactics to training to ship design. Aircraft carrier operations required coordination between pilots, mechanics, deck crews, and commanders, a complex dance under immense pressure. The successful execution of these operations at Midway was a testament to American innovation and determination. But this transition was not without cost. The men aboard those carriers, pilots, sailors, mechanics, faced new kinds of danger. Carrier battles were fast, chaotic, and brutal. One mistake could ignite a chain reaction of explosions. Lives hung in the balance with every takeoff and landing, every mission. The human stories behind the machines reveal the full weight of this new era. The aircrew's courage, the deck crew's precision, the commander's decisions, all intertwined in a high-stakes gamble with the fate of nations. As the sun set on the burning decks of the Japanese carriers, a new dawn rose for naval warfare. Midway was more than a battle. It was a transformation, a turning point that set the stage for the relentless push of Allied forces across the Pacific. The carriers became symbols of hope and power, floating islands of resilience that could project force across vast oceans. They allowed the United States to go on the offensive, turning the tide of the war and ultimately shaping the modern naval battlefield. Yet, the full impact of Midway's lessons took time to unfold. Carriers would continue to evolve, growing larger and more sophisticated, while the lessons learned from Midway's victories and losses informed future battles, Leyte Gulf, the Philippine Sea, and beyond. Midway confirmed that control of the skies was the key to controlling the seas. It shattered old myths and ushered in a new age where air power ruled the waves, where planes became the decisive factor in naval dominance. And in the hearts of those who fought and survived, Midway was a testament to adaptability, courage, and the relentless human spirit to innovate against all odds. But even as the carriers reigned supreme, the battle for the Pacific was far from over. The ocean remained vast and treacherous, and the war would demand even greater sacrifices, sharper strategies, and unyielding resolve. Midway was the beginning of a new chapter, one written in the roar of aircraft engines and the flash of aerial combat, a chapter where the sky was no longer the limit but the battlefield itself. The question lingered: could this new era withstand the brutal tests of war, and could the men who flew these iron birds continue to meet the challenges ahead? As the tides of war shifted, the story of Midway and the birth of the carrier era remained a beacon, an enduring reminder that in war, as in life, the ability to adapt and rise above often decides who wins and who falls. Chapter 26. What if Japan had won? The ocean was thick with smoke and fire, the horizon blurred by the deafening roar of explosions. The skies darkened not only by the burning wreckage of ships, but by the weight of a devastating truth. What if Midway had ended differently? What if the Japanese fleet, with its overwhelming might and tactical brilliance, had succeeded in sinking all three American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the barely repaired Yorktown, and seized Midway Island itself? This is the question that haunts the echoes of history, a chilling what if that reshapes the entire narrative of World War II in the Pacific. Imagine for a moment the American carriers, the last bulwarks of U.S. naval power in the Pacific, swallowed by fire and water. Imagine the strategic jewel of Midway, lost to the rising sun's banner, its airstrips and defenses overrun. The Japanese Navy, unopposed, tightening its grip on the Pacific, ready to push further into the vast ocean and beyond. What would the world have looked like then? What horrors and hardships might have unfolded had the scales tipped in favor of Japan on that fateful June day in 1942? The sinking of the three U.S. carriers would have been a catastrophic blow, not just tactically but psychologically, to the United States. These were not mere ships. They were symbols of hope, resilience, and the very heart of American naval strength. Their loss would have echoed like a death knell across the country, shaking the confidence of a nation still reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months prior. Without the carriers, the U.S. Pacific Fleet would have been crippled. The vast stretches of ocean that had been contested fiercely might have become unchallenged Japanese territory. The Imperial Navy, flush with victory, could have threatened Hawaii itself, possibly isolating the American West Coast from its Pacific allies and resources. Midway, strategically positioned at the heart of the Pacific, was far more than a speck of land. It was a shield protecting the Hawaiian Islands, a forward base for reconnaissance, refueling, and launching attacks. Its capture would have placed the Japanese within striking distance of Hawaii and the U.S. mainland, a frightening prospect for a nation grappling with war on multiple fronts. In this scenario, Japan's ability to control the Pacific would have been near absolute. Their supply lines secured, their advance unchecked, they could have pressed their advantage further into the Indian Ocean, threatening British colonies and disrupting Allied supply routes crucial for the war effort in Europe and Asia. The U.S. might have been forced into a defensive posture, retreating to regroup, rebuild, and rethink its Pacific strategy. The war could have stretched longer, bloodier, and more uncertain. But the consequences reached beyond military strategy. The morale of both nations would have shifted drastically. Japan's victory could have emboldened its leadership, increasing their appetite for expansion, and potentially prolonging their hold on occupied territories, intensifying suffering for millions caught in the conflict. On the American home front, the shock might have led to a crisis of faith in leadership and the war effort. The call to arms, so vital to mobilize millions of Americans, could have faltered under the shadow of such a crushing defeat. Yet, even in this dark alternate reality, the human spirit, stubborn and resilient, would have continued to fight. The same courage that defined the torpedo squadrons and dive bombers at Midway, the same grit that carried men through years of war, would not have faded. But how different would history have been? Would the U.S. have been able to rebuild its naval strength in time to push back? Would the balance of power in the Pacific and the world have tilted irrevocably? These questions linger in the minds of historians and dreamers alike, a stark reminder of how fragile the threads of fate truly are. The codebreakers at Station Hypo, the pilots who flew into deadly skies, and the commanders who gambled everything, all played roles in a delicate dance of chance and skill. The victory at Midway was not just a triumph of weapons and tactics, but of human will, ingenuity, and sacrifice. Had the dice fallen differently, the Pacific could have become a vastly different battlefield, one darker, more desperate, and more uncertain. As we ponder this alternate path, we honor those who fought on that day, who stared into the abyss and chose to fly forward, to fight back, to change the course of history with bravery and determination. The story of Midway is a story of survival against overwhelming odds, of hope where there was little, and of the power of individual acts to shape the destiny of nations. And yet, the shadow of what if remains, a reminder that history is never predetermined, but shaped by the choices, the courage, and the sacrifices of those who dare to act. The battle may have been won, but the war was far from over. The stakes were raised higher than ever, and the men who fought at Midway knew that the next fight would demand even more. As the Pacific War surged forward, the lessons from Midway, of risk, of resilience, of sacrifice, would be etched into the hearts of every sailor, pilot, and commander. But what if the carriers had sunk? What if Midway had fallen? The ocean keeps its secrets, but history whispers its warnings. The fragile balance between victory and defeat can turn on a single moment, a single decision, a single act of courage or failure. The question remains, what if? And in that question lies the haunting truth of Midway. The past is a battleground, and every victory is born from the thin line between chance and choice. Chapter 27, Midway Atoll today. The wind whistles softly over the coral reefs. The waves lap gently at the shores where once the roar of aircraft engines and the thunder of bombs echoed across the skies. Midway Atoll, once a crucible of war, a battlefield where men fought and died in a deadly dance of fire and courage, now stands silent, transformed. Here, where history burned bright in June 1942, nature has begun to reclaim its dominion. The island, scarred by conflict, has become a sanctuary for life, a living memorial preserving the memory of sacrifice and the fragile beauty of peace. Imagine walking on these sands. Beneath your feet, the ghosts of battles long past seem to stir, the rusting remains of bunkers and fortifications standing like weathered sentinels watching over the present. The air carries a quiet solemnity, a reverence born from the knowledge of what transpired here, the blood, the bravery, and the pivotal turning point that changed the course of a world at war. Midway Atoll today is far from the hellish crucible it once was. The heavy bomb craters have softened, filled with seawater and life. The once barren runways now cradle nesting birds, and the once buzzing radio towers are silent. It is a place of striking contrast, the enduring scars of war juxtaposed against the vibrant, thriving wildlife that calls this remote atoll home. The United States has carefully preserved this sacred space, transforming it into a national wildlife refuge and historical site. The effort is a testament to a deep respect for history and a recognition of the island's dual role as both a battlefield and a sanctuary. Walking here, one might encounter the famous Lisuan albatrosses, their wings stretching wide against the wind as they glide effortlessly over the turquoise waters. These birds, sometimes called Goonie birds by sailors, have found a haven on Midway's isolated shores, safe from predators and human disturbance. Their nesting grounds carpet the island, a breathtaking spectacle of life persisting where so much death once reigned. Beneath the waves, vibrant coral reefs teem with colorful fish and marine creatures. The atoll is a jewel of biodiversity, a living laboratory for scientists and conservationists dedicated to understanding and protecting the delicate balance of ocean ecosystems. Yet, amid this beauty lies the enduring memory of the men who fought here. Pilots who flew into impossible odds, sailors who manned guns under relentless assault, and Marines who stood firm against overwhelming fire. The island's memorials honor their sacrifice, carved stone and plaques telling stories of courage, loss, and the hope that from destruction comes renewal. Visiting Midway today is a journey through time. The rusted remnants of war machines lie half-buried in sand and coral, silent witnesses to the fury of battle. These relics remind us that beneath the surface of peace lies the cost of freedom, the lives given, the decisions made in moments of unimaginable pressure. The historical sites are carefully maintained, with ranger-led tours offering visitors a chance to connect with the past. Photographs and personal letters from those who were here bring a human face to the battle, transforming distant history into intimate stories of love, fear, determination, and hope. But Midway is more than a museum. It is a symbol of resilience. The island itself, battered by war and weather, has healed over the decades, a metaphor for humanity's capacity to recover from the darkest chapters. Its wildlife flourishes, a reminder that life can triumph even in the aftermath of destruction. The atoll also serves as a vital outpost for scientific research, particularly in understanding the effects of climate change and human activity on ocean environments. Its remote location offers a pristine environment to study marine life and coral health, making it a critical site for global conservation efforts. Yet, the story of Midway is not just about nature or history. It is about memory. It is about the responsibility we carry to remember the sacrifices made on these shores, to honor the bravery of those who fought, and to ensure that the lessons of war are never forgotten. Each year, veterans and families return to Midway, their footsteps tracing the paths of those who came before. Ceremonies mark anniversaries, where voices rise in song and remembrance, the silence broken by stories passed from one generation to the next. The atoll, though remote and isolated, connects us all to a pivotal moment in history, a moment when courage, sacrifice, and determination changed the tides of war and shaped the modern world. Walking beneath the shadow of rusted guns and near the remnants of old bunkers, visitors can feel the weight of history pressing gently on their shoulders. It is a solemn reminder that peace is fragile, that freedom is earned through sacrifice, and that memory is the bridge between past and future. Midway's transformation from a battlefield to a sanctuary is a testament to the enduring human spirit, a commitment to preserve, to heal, and to honor. But even as nature thrives and memories endure, the island faces new challenges. Rising sea levels, climate change, and human impact threaten this fragile ecosystem, echoing the ongoing struggle to protect the legacies we hold dear. The story of Midway Atoll today is one of contrasts. the harsh realities of war and the tender resilience of life, the past etched in stone and rust, and the present alive with birdsong and ocean waves. As the sun sets over the Pacific, casting golden light on the atolls' serene shores, the ghosts of Midway whisper their stories into the wind, stories of sacrifice, courage, and hope that continue to resonate, calling us to remember, to learn, and to protect. For Midway is not just a place on a map. It is a living memory, a sanctuary for life, and a beacon of what humanity can endure and overcome. And as long as the waves crash against its shores, as long as the albatross soars above, Midway will stand, silent, solemn, and eternal. Chapter 28. A Battle for the Ages. The sky above the vast Pacific that day was a canvas of chaos. Explosions ripped through the clouds. Aircraft screamed like banshees, and below, the restless sea churned with the fury of men and machines locked in a deadly struggle. Midway, a tiny dot in the ocean. Yet, on June the 4th, 1942, it became the stage for a battle unlike any other, a battle that would echo through history, shaping the fate of nations and changing the course of a war that engulfed the globe. At the heart of this epic clash was a convergence of courage, strategy, and timing, a perfect storm of human resolve and calculated risk. This was no ordinary fight. It was a battle of wits and wills, of sacrifices made in the shadows and decisions taken in split seconds. The Battle of Midway remains one of the greatest naval victories ever recorded, not just for the ships sunk or men lost, but for the profound shift it caused in the balance of power across the Pacific. To understand why Midway stands apart, we must first look beyond the thunder of guns and the smoke of burning carriers. We must see the faces behind the helmets, the young pilots gripping their controls with trembling hands, the sailors manning their stations amid the deafening roar of anti-aircraft fire, the codebreakers in dimly lit rooms piecing together fragments of enemy secrets. Each played a part in a tapestry woven with threads of bravery, sacrifice, and sheer human will. Imagine the tension in the moments before the battle began. The Americans, led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, were walking a razor's edge. They knew the Japanese were coming, but the enemy's plans were cloaked in mystery, hidden behind complex codes and cunning deception. Yet, through the tireless work of cryptographers like Joseph Rockefford, the veil was lifted just enough to reveal the true target, Midway itself. Nimitz's gamble to set a trap for the Japanese fleet was a moment of profound faith, in intelligence, in his commanders, and in the resolve of his men. It was like placing a single chess piece in the right square, hoping it would checkmate an opponent with far greater forces. But in war, chance is a cruel companion. The success of such a plan depended on timing, the precise moment to strike, when the enemy was vulnerable and exposed. The Japanese, under Admiral Yamamoto, had orchestrated an ambitious operation. Their goal was to draw the American fleet into a trap, destroy their carriers, and secure domination of the Pacific. They were confident, their veterans battle-hardened and their machinery superior, or so they believed. But war is often a contest of unforeseen variables. At Midway, the tide would turn against them, not just because of technology or numbers, but because of human courage and the unpredictability of battle. Picture the torpedo squadrons, small groups of biplanes and torpedo bombers, flying without fighter escort into a hailstorm of enemy fire. Their planes were slow, vulnerable, and outgunned. Yet they pressed forward, flying into the teeth of Japanese defenses, many never to return. Their sacrifice was not in vain. By drawing the enemy's fighters down and disrupting their formation, they created the opening dive bombers needed. It was a grim, costly dance, a story of valor written in the skies and blood. When the dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown arrived, their attack was devastating. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's mighty carriers were ablaze, their decks shattered, their crews scrambling for survival. The shock was immense. It was a moment that swung the balance of the Pacific, shaking the Japanese Navy to its core. But the battle was far from over. The Hiru, the last of the 4 carriers, retaliated with fierce strikes that severely damaged the Yorktown. The chaos was unrelenting. Fires raged, alarms blared, and men fought desperately against mounting odds. The sight of burning ships and plumes of smoke was a grim reminder that victory was always costly. And yet, despite the damage to the Yorktown, the Americans never lost hope or composure. Damage control teams worked feverishly, patching holes, battling floods, and keeping the carrier afloat just long enough to keep fighting. The resilience shown on that battered deck was emblematic of the entire battle, a refusal to yield, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. The Japanese losses were staggering. For carriers sunk, countless planes destroyed, and over 3,000 men lost. But beyond the numbers, the blow was in the loss of experienced pilots and crew, irreplaceable human capital that the Japanese Navy would struggle to replace. This attrition struck at the heart of Japan's naval power, altering the trajectory of the war. On the American side, the loss of the Yorktown and one destroyer, along with 307 lives, was deeply felt. Yet, the victory at Midway was a beacon of hope, a proof that courage combined with intelligence and timing could overcome even the most formidable foes. The battle's legacy is also a story of leadership. Admiral Nimitz, calm and resolute, guided his forces with steady hands. His faith in his men and in the painstaking work of his intelligence officers shaped the outcome. And beyond the generals, the pilots, sailors, and Marines who faced unimaginable danger and uncertainty embodied the spirit of sacrifice and determination. Midway was not merely a battle fought with steel and fire. It was a crucible where character was tested, where ordinary men did extraordinary things. It is a story of split-second decisions, of trust forged in adversity, and of a nation's resolve to defend its freedom. Today, historians continue to study Midway, drawing lessons about strategy, intelligence, and human courage. It remains a defining moment in naval warfare, a testament to how information, timing, and bravery can converge to change history. The battle also serves as a powerful reminder of the costs of war, the lives forever altered, the families left behind, and the shadows that linger long after the guns fall silent. Midway teaches us that victory is never free, and that the price paid is borne by real people, with hopes, fears, and dreams. As the sun sets over the Pacific, the echoes of Midway remind us that history is alive in memory, that courage can change the tide, and that the smallest islands can hold the greatest stories. It is a battle for the ages, not just for its tactical brilliance or its place in military history, but for the human spirit that burned bright amidst the smoke and fire. In the end, Midway was more than a battle. It was a turning point, a symbol, a testament. It was proof that in the darkest hours, courage and conviction can illuminate a path forward. And as the waves wash over the atoll, carrying whispers of those who fought and fell, the story of Midway endures, timeless, powerful, and eternal.